Section 15 of the Romance of the Romanoffs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of the Romanoffs by Joseph Martin McCabe. Chapter 12. In the Days of Napoleon. The story of the Romanoffs has three phases. The first is the preparation, when the primitive democracy of the Slavs is slowly destroyed and the people are enslaved to an autocracy. The second, and longest, phase is the enjoyment of power by the Romanoffs, the succession of brutal or genial, strong or weak, merry or pious sovereigns whom the accident of birth or the red hand of revolution raises to the throne. A certain nervous instability runs through nearly the whole series, but it is almost invariably expressed in a determination to enjoy, to kill, to drink, to love, to spend, to seize territory, to use power for self-gratification. In Peter the Great we find a glimmer, amidst the old disorder, of a new day. In Catherine the Great it revives and grows. Now the middle phase is over. We enter upon a period of grave and sober living monarchs, at first bent upon the reform of their people, according to their ideals, then struggling in fear against the people they have awakened from a long slumber. The reign of Paul I is merely a dark episode between the second and the third phase. He was now 42 years old. A short, ugly, bald, sour-tempered man, of diseased nerves. He hardly concealed his joy as he hastened to the throne and strove to obliterate the memory of his great mother. If she must have an imperial funeral, his martyred father shall have one also. He digs up the corpse, or what is left of it after 34 years, puts it in a magnificent coffin, and makes the survivors of the conspiracy of 1762 walk humbly behind it, before they are exiled. St. Petersburg is still a land of rumors, and we do not know precisely what form his mad idea took. Some say that there was body enough left to seat in the throne. Some say that the skull was put upon the altar and crowned with a superb diadem. Some say that only the boots and a few fragments of Peter III were found. Whatever, there was received an imperial funeral, and the bones of Pobiedonostseff were dug up and cast into a ditch. The usual golden shower descended upon the new brood of favorites. Then Paul began to enforce his grand schemes of military reform, and alienate the army. They must abandon those new and serviceable uniforms which Potemkin had given them. They must return to powdered hair and pigtails. Paul went along the line, on parade, and used his cane freely. Old General Suvorov grumbled, and was banished, though he had to be recalled when war broke out. A regiment one day threw Paul into one of his hurricanes of rage. "March! To Siberia!" he thundered, and they marched, but were stopped on the way. Everything must be done on the German model. Anything that reminded him of France was anathema. More than 12,000 people were exiled or imprisoned in 4 years, generally for trivial offenses. He made some useful changes, but so many that were petty and irritating that men thought him insane. He was, in fact, on the road to insanity. He suffered from insomnia, and took opium. People fled at his approach. Paul sincerely wanted peace, but the French were overrunning Europe, and he joined forces with Austria against them. Austria cooperated so badly that his army, ably led by Suvorov, had to retreat disastrously. Bonaparte watched him astutely, and bribed his chief ministers. Next, England irritated him. Like Catherine, he challenged England's right to search neutral vessels, and, whereas England kept its Russian prisoners, Bonaparte sent home neatly dressed and armed, those that had been taken by France. When England went on to take Malta, Bonaparte had an easy victim. Paul had become Grand Master of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and he considered that this gave him a special interest in Malta. At the beginning of 1801 Paul was pledged to France and set about the formation of a league against England, and on March 24th, after a gloomy reign of 4.5 years, Paul met the end he had expected. He had heavily fortified the Mikhailovsky Palace, in which he lived, but about midnight, March 23 to 24, Count Zuboff, Count Phelan, General Bennigsen, and a few others entered his chamber, roused him, and invited him to abdicate. He refused, and it is presumed that a scuffle followed. It is at least certain that Paul was strangled. It was officially announced that Paul died of apoplexy. "Isn't it time they invented a new disease in Russia?" said Talleyrand when he heard. Napoleon was furious. Alexander I lay upon his bed, dressed, when Count Zuboff rushed in to say that all was over. He started, but he was at once addressed as Emperor and could not misunderstand. He had agreed to the enforcement of his father's abdication, but had assuredly done no more. Whether he had looked beyond or no we cannot say, but Alexander was a high-minded man, a new type of Romanoff. While they talked, Paul's widow came and heard the news. She shrieked that she was empress, and begged the soldiers to support her rights. There was a second horrible scene in the darkness of that winter night. They drew her away, and, when the day broke, St. Petersburg burst into open and enthusiastic rejoicing, such as Romans had shown at the death of Domitian. That the gloomy and misguided Paul had gone the way of so many czars and princes. Strangers embraced in the streets. There was no trial, but those who had been in the plot were leniently removed. Alexander I, the monarch who opens the new phase, came to the throne with large and vague and lofty ideals. Not only should Russia become happy and prosperous under his benevolent despotism, but all Europe should be illumined. He averted the threatened war with England, which had sent a fleet to the Baltic, and reaffirmed the friendship with Napoleon. His new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kochubey, agreed with him. Russia must be kept clear of the entanglement of war and concentrate upon internal reform. Kochubey had soon to give place to the Pole Czartoryski, who more sincerely shared Alexander's romantic idealism. The Tsar of Russia was to inaugurate a new era of justice and right for the whole of Europe. An envoy was sent to London to propose, "There is nothing new under the sun," a sort of league to enforce peace. England and Russia, the two powers which desired no further territory, were to form its nucleus. Other powers might join. One hears plainly the echo of the French humanitarians and the English whom they inspired. But how was the League to enforce peace upon France? Russia moved slowly toward war. In 1804 the Duc d'Enghien was murdered, and Alexander was outraged. He came to an agreement with England to chastise Napoleon, only, as far as Alexander was concerned, for his monstrous breaches of international law. Napoleon became Emperor and King of Italy, and Alexander was further outraged. Kings were born, not made. In 1805 he joined the Austrians on the battlefields of Italy. The story of Alexander I, the monarch who was going to impose peace upon a foolish and distracted world, is one long story of wars, and it does not enter into the scheme of this book to describe wars. How far Alexander was to blame for the entry of his country into the struggle against Napoleon, or into Napoleon's struggle against England, is a point on which opinions differ. His entire change of attitude, from neutrality to war against France, then to friendship with Napoleon, then back to the English alliance, annoyed his ministers and people, and lays him open to a charge of nervous instability. Such a charge he would have rebutted with warmth and astonishment. His portrait is familiar, a smooth-faced, dignified man, reflecting righteousness in every feature. He would have given 100 reasons for each change in his policy. We will notice these and the issues of his wars briefly, before we consider his personality and his domestic work. His first war ended in the historic rout of Austerlitz, 1805, and his optimism was sadly clouded. But when his mind was fixed upon what he regarded as a righteous cause, he could be obstinate. Prussia and Austria came to terms with France, and Alexander's advisers were for doing the same. But he refused. He entered the new coalition, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and England. Napoleon smote the Prussians at Jena, frightened the Swedes into peace, and inflicted appalling losses upon the Russians at Eylau. Alexander would not desist. He saw the King of Prussia and swore eternal alliance, and Napoleon overran Poland, 1806-7. But Napoleon understood the naive mind of the Czar, and knew that he was angry at the remissness of England in supporting him. Before long he met Alexander on a raft in the middle of the Niemen, and the charm of his manner and righteousness of his proposals won the large heart of the Czar. Besides that, Napoleon cleverly conveyed to his mind the impression that he thought seriously of choosing Alexander's sister Anna as his second wife. At the entreaty of his new friend, Napoleon spared the sovereignty of Frederick William of Prussia, though he relieved him of his Polish gains, and turned Poland into a duchy of Warsaw. Kornilov, the ablest of recent Russian historians, maintains that Alexander was not duped. He wanted time, and played his cards skillfully. It is not easy to credit Alexander with such subtlety, and there are those who think that Alexander sacrificed his honor and the interest of his country. He was to break with England, when all St. Petersburg had been educated to admire England, and he was not to receive Constantinople as his reward. St. Petersburg was thoroughly angry at the change of policy, and Alexander had to change his ministers. The Russian ambassador at Paris secured a confidential document in which Napoleon declared that Russia was the natural ally of Austria and inevitable enemy of France. Still Alexander persisted, though he was not a very useful ally. He did, it is true, make war upon Sweden because it would not place an embargo on British ships, but out of that war he got the remainder of Finland, with 900,000 souls, for Russia. The two emperors met again at Erfurt in 1810. Napoleon had there a mighty gathering of his royal vassals, partly to impress Alexander, and he seemed to succeed. In later years, however, Napoleon himself considered that Alexander was fooling him. He said that the Czar had the duplicity of a Byzantine Greek. Napoleon was a judge of duplicity, but I prefer to believe in the simple-mindedness of Alexander, and do not even see ground to seek psychological explanations of his vacillations. He respected to the end the genius of Napoleon, but the alliance was hollow, and in the next year the causes of quarrel multiplied. Napoleon said no more about the Tsarevna Anna. He married an Austrian. He seemed anxious to turn Poland into a French province. On the other hand, Napoleon complained that his ally spoiled his continental blockade against England, and put heavy duties on French wine. Alexander, pushed by intriguers, got rid of his ablest minister, Speransky, who was pro-French, made peace with Turkey and Sweden, and at length entered into an alliance with England and Sweden. Both emperors now massed their troops at the frontier and joined them. Napoleon's famous Russian campaign of 1812 need not be described here. The Poles hailed him as a deliverer, and he ran on until the continuous retreat of the Russians and the appalling desolation they created as they retreated made him uneasy. It was Alexander's generals who were responsible for that strategy. The Tsar himself expressed impatience. At length, on September 15th, Napoleon gazed upon the golden roofs of Moscow and felt that the end was in sight. How could Russia yield its ancient capital and not acknowledge defeat? The next day began the historic fire of Moscow, already evacuated by its population. Whether or no General Rostopchin ordered the fire, the Tsar was not privy to it. He wept when he heard of the tragedy, but it was a tragedy for Napoleon also. The grip of winter soon began to close upon the desolated land. The Tsar was whipping up his weary people with manifests after manifests, imploring them to break the tyrant and help to take the blessings of liberty to other nations. We shall see presently that at this period he became almost fanatically religious. At the head of his inspirited troops, he would, he said, not again leave his armies to unenterprising generals, who could only retreat. Alexander followed the pale and emaciated remnant of Napoleon's grand army across the corpse-strewn wastes. Then came Leipzig, the first nail in Napoleon's coffin. The Austrian statesman Metternich saw the Tsar at Frankfurt, and was for moderation and victory. On to Paris, said the Tsar, and the encircling movement pushed the French gradually in toward their capital. He was at Paris for the end, and he spent a few weeks in London before he returned to receive a magnificent, and not unmerited, ovation at St. Petersburg. Alexander went himself to Vienna for the Congress which was to settle the map of Europe. Again one must glance at his portrait to imagine him at Vienna. He was the modest arbiter of the destinies of Europe, the conqueror of Napoleon. Behind the scenes, however, was a limping diplomatist named Talleyrand, who had returned to office with Louis XVIII, and he and Metternich and Castlereagh ruled. Against Alexander's wish Poland was again divided, only Cracow and its district receiving a republican independence. Napoleon suspended their intrigues for a season by his dramatic return, but after Waterloo the monarchs and statesmen met again at Paris to complete their work. Here the personality of Alexander attracted considerable, and not very flattering, attention, and we may linger over one of the last bits of personal romance, of very chaste romance, in the story of the Romanoffs, in the house adjoining his hotel. And connected with it, Alexander established a lady who was soon known to all Paris. This was the Baroness Barbara Juliana von Prudener. In her youth, Juliana had been a fascinating and gay lady, of Prussian birth, who had virtually deserted her elderly and prosy German baron for a French officer. Her nerves deteriorated with her charms, and in 1804, her 40th year, she had been very seriously converted. A gentle man who was paying court to her had fallen dead at her feet. Wandering to and fro in a state of extreme nervousness, she came into touch with the Moravian brethren and got religion. The long war and comprehensive disturbance of Europe had led to remarkable eruptions of mysticism. Napoleon was Antichrist. The end of the world was at hand. Prophets arose in every German village, and Juliana eagerly sought them. She became convinced that it was her mission to preach the millennium which was to precede the end. In 1814 she met at the Tsarina Elizabeth at Baden, and through her she attempted to reach the Tsar. Alexander refused for some time to see her, but he in turn went to Baden in 1815, and he allowed her to call. She found him in a receptive mood. Since the burning of Moscow he had spent much time over the Scriptures, and he was at this moment brooding over the open page, seeking in vain the remedy of his mysterious restlessness. Juliana harangued him stormily for 3 hours, and captured him. He brought her to Paris, put her in the house next his own, and attended her prayer meetings. Nobles and famous writers of Paris attended. Over all the horrors of the past men saw dawning the glory of a new religious epoch. All this has more historical and practical import than may be imagined. Alexander invented a holy alliance of monarchs to put into force the lofty moral tenets of the new mysticism. He showed the Baroness one day. She annoyed him afterwards by claiming that she had written it, the draft of a manifest of the alliance. In 3 short articles the royal signatories would bind themselves thenceforward to be guided, in domestic and foreign policy, by the precepts of that holy religion, Christianity, namely, the precepts of justice, charity, and peace. The whole document breathed the spiritual exaltation in which the Czar was at the time. The King of Prussia signed it without wincing, to oblige his friend, Francis of Austria, very pious, but taught by the Jesuits to suspect heresy everywhere, consulted Metternich, who said it was a harmless piece of folly. He signed it. Castlereagh advised the English Prince Regent that it was a piece of sublime mysticism and nonsense, and the gay Regent accepted it in principle, without signing it, and assured the Tsar that he would follow its sacred maxims. The Pope refused to sign. The practical importance of the matter is that the Holy Alliance became, in effect, an alliance for the bloody suppression of democracy and enlightenment, and the charter drawn up by Alexander became the code of his persecuting successors and their nationalist supporters. Western Christianity became faithless. It compromised with democracy, with science, with liberalism. So the holy religion must be the uncompromising Church of Russia, with its profound reverence for autocracy and its hostility to enlightenment. Alexander became sensitive that his association with the Baroness made him seem rather ridiculous. He got rid of her, and from that time maintained only a coldly polite correspondence. The astute Metternich gained increasing influence over him, and there was no vagueness about Metternich. Kings must guard their crowns, and ministers their portfolios, against anybody, adventurers or democracies, who wanted them. When the Greeks rose against Turkey in 1821, the Baroness rushed to St. Petersburg and urged her pupil to take up the holy war. Metternich told him that the situation was that the Greeks had rebelled against their lawful sovereign, the Sultan. So Alexander would not send a gun to aid either the Slav or Greek victims of the terrible Turk. The whole Russian nation opposed him. When a great flood brought tragedy upon St. Petersburg in 1824, men said that God was punishing the Tsar. He was troubled, but did nothing. Justice, charity, and peace he still loved. But he would lend no aid to insurrection. For the remainder of his life he defended the absolute divine right of kings, and assisted in attempting to retard the birth of modernism. The Poles felt his gradual deterioration. Russian Poland was at first, with a show of generosity, converted into an autonomous kingdom under the Russian crown. Alexander was the king, though the Poles had their old flag with the white eagle. The Grand Duke Constantine was commander of the army, though it was a Polish army. An officer of Napoleon's army was made viceroy, and a general amnesty was granted. But Warsaw was far away, and the harsh Constantine and the Tsar's more reactionary ministers ruled it. The Diet was soon left in abeyance, and the promises of reform unfulfilled. The Poles angrily muttered that they had been duped, and secret societies spread, with a result which we shall see later. But we are passing to Alexander's last phase, the phase of reaction, without having considered the reforms which came of his early humanitarian zeal. He had, we saw, been educated in part by humanitarians like La Harpe, imbued with the French spirit. Catherine herself had, as I said, leaned to reaction, and let her reforms droop in her later years, and the interlude of Paul's reign had been thoroughly bad. Yet Alexander came to the throne with a magnificent resolution to reform Russia. He was dreamy by temperament, and he had neither the positive knowledge nor the quality of painstaking perseverance which were necessary to construct a detailed scheme of reform for so comprehensively backward a country. However, he appointed a committee of reform, and he followed its deliberations with keen interest. During many years, especially from 1807 to 1812, Alexander had for this work the splendid ability and devotion of a remarkably enlightened and democratic statesman named Speransky. Professor Kornilov regards him as one of the most remarkable statesmen in all Russian history. He was the son of an obscure priest, a child of the people, and his large mind and great capacity for detail enabled him to give definite shape to the Tsar's vague dreams of justice. He not only studied the new democratic constitution of the United States, of which the Tsar obtained a copy from Washington, but he followed Napoleon's constructive work with much sympathy and admiration. To Speransky the Tsar owed the great scheme of reform which at first he made some effort to impose upon Russia. It, unhappily, remained for the most part a paper scheme. Years afterwards, in 1830, the rebellious Poles found a copy of Speransky's liberal constitution and printed it, but Nicholas I emphatically suppressed it. The first task was to reform the central part of the administration, which was chaotic. 8 ministries were created, and, although the Tsar made the inevitable blunder of appointing favorites rather than competent men in some cases, the change helped to create a more effective machine. The heads of the departments were to form a cabinet, or council of ministers, responsible to the emperor, and below them the administrative structure went down gradually as far as the mir, or village council. The legislative machinery also began with the Mir, and ended with the Duma, or National Council, from which there could be an appeal to the Imperial Council. The administration of justice was to begin in the village and end in a reconstituted Senate, and Speransky sketched a new code of laws on the model of the Code Napoleon. Of this great scheme very little was carried out. The reformed Senate found most of its proposals opposed by the Imperial Council, and the Tsar himself, who was to be guided by it, chafed when it did not fall in with his wishes, and often issued ukases in defiance of the opinion of the majority. The new code of laws was put upon the shelf, and remained there until the reign of Nicholas I. The hierarchy of popular councils was not created. Alexander seemed to shrink from the logical consequences of his sacred maxims when they were drawn out on paper by a practical statesman, and he lent too ready an ear to the reactionaries. As his piety increased, the conservatives found it convenient to represent to him that these progressive ideas were associated with atheism and revolt. The familiar type of political adventurer, a man named Arakchev, appeared at court and secured wealth and power. This man and his associates suggested to Alexander, in 1812, that Speransky was promoting Freemasonry and subversive ideas, and the great statesman, a man so far from Voltaireanism that he had translated The Imitation of Christ into Russian, had to go. The Tsar wept maudlin tears while he dismissed him. The Ministry of Education, or of National Enlightenment, whose task was vital to the reform of the country, seemed to make greater progress. Alexander entrusted it to his mother's educational adviser, Count Zadovsky, and his own tutor Muraviv. Afterwards it was controlled by Prince Golitsyn, a follower of the new mysticism, but a serious and liberal statesman. He was a patron of the Protestant Bible Society, which Alexander permitted to open premises in St. Petersburg in 1812. Alexander found from 2 to 3 million rubles a year for the education department, and paid out of his own purse for the translation of Western works. Students were sent abroad for pedagogical training, and after a time training colleges were established in Russia. 3 new universities, Dorpat, Kazan, and Kharkov, were founded, and these and the older universities were to become central points in a scheme of enlightenment for the various districts of Russia. It is, however, usual to exaggerate the work done. We have already heard much about the reforms of various rulers, of Philaret, of Peter I, of Elizabeth, and of Catherine. But the fact remains that far more than 90% of the Russian people were still illiterate and densely ignorant at the death of Alexander, and, although we shall hear of further reforms, at least 85% of the Russian people were illiterate at the beginning of the 20th century. The sum provided for education was ludicrously insufficient for the task, and the opposition was considerable. Merchants grumbled that they must pay for the teaching of something more than reading, writing, and arithmetic. The bulk of the nobles wanted only a military education for their sons. In all, about 200 higher schools, with classes of Latin and Greek, and 2,000 elementary schools, were founded, barely enough to educate the 5% of the population which was attracted to new ideas. The work, like all the other reforms, languished in Alexander's later years, and was deliberately checked, in the interest of the dynasty, by his successor. The next great problem was the emancipation of the serfs, and here the Tsar's vacillation between his sentiments of benevolence and his vague perception that they threatened the aristocratic system is more apparent than ever. Catherine had had the same experience. She had spoken of liberty and equality, and she had bestowed upon her favorites hundreds of thousands of serfs who would, she must have known, be regarded and treated as cattle. The restriction of the freedom of the peasant, by which Godunoff had converted him into a serf, really handed over his freedom to the higher authorities or put it into the hand of the land owner. When a peasant wished to move, he might secure permission from his lord by a payment of money. When a noble obtained a grant of new lands he had to buy, or obtain by favor, a great batch of serfs to work it. In practice the wealthy land owners bought and sold the population just as cotton planters then did in America, and the serfs were generally treated with brutality. Nearly every other country in Europe had long since abolished serfdom, and Alexander saw clearly enough how inconsistent the institution was with his sacred maxims. He discussed with his friends this barbarous traffic in human beings, and we can understand how they assisted him to salve his conscience. Reform must be gradual. An evil which was centuries old, and rooted in the very structure of Russian society, could not be cured in a day. In other words, the great sacrifice which justice demanded, must be thrown upon a later generation. Alexander expended his zeal upon small alleviations of the sufferings of the serfs. He forbade the masters to break up families, or to enforce marriage upon reluctant serfs. He restricted the right of punishment, opened the courts to the serf, and set aside large sums for the emancipation of batches of serfs. He had a pamphlet published in which owners were urged to treat the serfs humanely and promote emancipation. So much was done under pressure of the humanitarians, but it was only a trifling mitigation of the worst evil of medieval Russia, and the new regulations were not properly enforced. Russia was the land of the wealthy. The millions of descendants of the original free Slavs must toil on in squalor and ignorance. The day of reckoning was still to come. Arakchev tried an experiment in this connection which was bitterly resented. He induced the Tsar to settle regiments of soldiers, with their families, on the crown lands, in military colonies. They were to be special breeding grounds for recruits, and were to spread amongst the peasants the spirit of military discipline. They were so carefully organized, for Arakchev had ability, that even the mother was provided with a set of rules which she must hang beside the holy icons. The peasants hated the innovation, and on Arakchev's own estate they rebelled and killed his mistress. who ruled them with the brutality that he encouraged. The institution was afterward suffered to decay. In the fiscal world, which was but another section of the Augean stable of the Russian system, Alexander set out to make enlightened reforms, and ended in the usual listlessness. The treasury had long been artificially filled by the excessive creation of paper money. Alexander recalled a large proportion of it, but the strain of the war put an end to this reform. An imperial bank was founded, a sinking fund was started, and it was decided to publish an annual budget. It was proposed, and partly attempted, to relieve the duty on the importation of raw materials and impose heavy duties on luxuries. At the same time, the abandonment of Catherine's extravagance at court relieved the exchequer. These reforms were, like the others, a comparatively slight mitigation of a great evil, and were in Alexander's later years suffered to droop. In fine, one must mention prison reform, though the state of Russian jails decades later does not dispose us to attach much importance to it. During Alexander's earlier years, we saw, there was at St. Petersburg a great regard for English ideas, and at that time England was producing many humanitarians. Robert Owen was then elaborating his comprehensive and advanced schemes of reform. From the betterment of schools and prisons to the substitution of arbitration for war. It is the enfeebled echo of these liberal English ideas, and of American and French ideas, that we find in the Russian schemes. One of the English prison reformers, Mr. Venning, asked permission to visit the Russian jails. The Czar, who was still in his early humanitarian fervor, gladly assented, and asked Venning to make a report to him on what he saw. As a result, a society for the welfare of prisoners was founded at St. Petersburg, and afterwards at Moscow. These liberal ideas represent, it must be understood, the early attitude of the emperor. After the fall of Speransky in 1812, and especially after the Tsar's close association with Metternich in 1814, Alexander passed slowly from a state of nebulous zeal for charity and justice to an attitude of positive reaction, tempered by a faint, lingering glow of his early dreams. Metternich persuaded him that the real struggle of light and darkness was the struggle of the enlightened monarchies against these democratic and atheistic emanations from the smothered volcano of the French Revolution. In private he cynically observed to his friends, "I have the Tsar safely at anchor." The humanitarian ideas on which the United States had been set up, and the early and sane part of the French Revolution had been based, remained in the mind of Europe. They threatened the restored monarchies, which reverted to medieval ideas of their power, and the terrible conflict which fills the first half of the 19th century in Europe began long before the death of Alexander. It is to his credit that he recognized the blunders and crimes of his fellow monarchs and never entirely sacrificed his early ideals. But the sinister Arakchev and the dreamy Golitsyn spoiled the efforts of Speransky. Golitsyn introduced to the Tsar a converted atheist named Magnitsky, an abominable adventurer, and the man was put in control of the universities. The higher teaching was reduced to a comedy. Golitsyn himself was too liberal and cultivated for the plotters, and Admiral Shishkov replaced him in charge of the Ministry of National Enlightenment. Shishkov hated liberalism, and would suffer no education that did not strengthen in the pupil's mind a spirit of blind subservience to the Church and the autocracy. A third power among the reactionary forces was the Novgorod abbot, Foti, a zealot of the old type who gathered about him a crowd of aristocratic women and worked through them. Professors who had any tincture of liberalism were now expelled from the schools. Some of the new schools were suffered to disappear, and in all, lower and higher, the teaching was rendered ridiculous by the fierce determination to protect the pupil's respect for his pastors and masters. Political economy and the new discoveries of science were rigorously banned. The Russophile school was established. the fight against enlightenment was inaugurated. But enlightenment could no more be suppressed in Russia than in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France, where the papacy and the restored monarchs used the old bludgeons against it. A large part of the nobles was, as in France before the Revolution, imbued with the new ideas, and the economic and other reforms were creating a middle class which, as in England, gave many recruits to the humanitarian cause. Students, teachers, writers, medical and other professional men joined the emancipated nobles. The army of light began slowly to gather round its various banners and face the army of darkness. As repression increased, the many societies and liberal journals were merely driven underground and their rhetoric became more fiery. There were unions for everything of an advanced nature. In obscure clubs young men began to talk even of a Russian republic. The Tsar's refusal to help the Slav and Greek rebels against the Turk increased the anger of the liberals and gave them a basis in the popular mind. By the year 1824 Alexander had fallen into so morbid a state that he spoke of resigning. He wept over his Bible and wondered if his sins were not the curse of Russia. Even his domestic life was a burden. He had married a princess of Baden, and her lack of good looks was not redeemed by any other charm except the cold adornments of virtue and piety. She dressed dowdily, and she generally presented at his board a face as melancholy as her creed. For many years Alexander had lived apart from her, and he had no children. The genial dignity and self-esteem of his earlier years broke down altogether. His next brother, Constantine, had made a morganatic marriage, and forfeited the throne, and Alexander distrusted the third brother, Nicholas. Alexander slowly and sadly drifted toward the grave. His courtiers discovered a plot against the autocracy, but he would do nothing. He died on December 1st, 1825, a high-minded, well-meaning man, too little endowed in intellect and strength of will to solve the mighty problems which were raised by his own ideals. End of section 15.
Of the Romance of the Romanoffs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. By Jenny Cochran, West Vancouver, BC, Canada, Jenny Marie Cochran at gmail.com. The Romance of the Romanoffs by Joseph Martin McCabe. On an earlier page, I remarked that the element of romance passed out of the story of the Romanoffs with the last lovers of Catherine and the murder of Paul. This is true of what we may call personal romance, but it will have been apparent that a larger impersonal romance now opens. Not individual Romanoffs, but the Romanov dynasty must fight for existence. Life at court is now too earnest for bibulous companions of monarchs and handsome lovers of queens and plots of the anteroom. The comedy is over. If one may call a comedy the enthronement of a selfish and profligate monarchy upon the poverty and ignorance of millions of human beings, the play now assumes the somber note of tragedy. The people, represented by a few of the educated few, begin to awaken and claim their rights. The rest of the story is a ghastly record of the efforts of the Romanoffs to prevent the spread of that awakening. Nicholas I, who succeeded Alexander, represents the struggle of the dynasty in a form which might be reconciled with conscience. He differed materially from Alexander in two respects. First, although he was, like Alexander, moderately endowed in intellect, he had great strength of character and would stubbornly pursue any policy which he adopted. In the second place, that policy was inevitably shaped by the accident that he was born many years after Alexander. The eldest son of Paul I had received his education at a time when Catherine was under the influence of the French humanitarians. Nicholas came to the years of discretion during her second phase, when the Revolution had soured her taste of all things French and liberal. His chief tutor had been a French immigrant, an incompetent teacher, and a bitter enemy of liberal ideas. Nicholas had grown up a rough and conceited boy. Later he had abler teachers, but he had yawned over their lessons. He had in 1817 married a daughter of the King of Prussia, and, like almost all the Romanoffs, he thought a minute acquaintance with military drill the first equipment for life. In spite of hints from Alexander, he refused to prepare for the serious task of governing a great nation. By an unfortunate accident, his vague, despotic mood was at the very opening of his reign hardened into an attitude of fierce hostility to the new culture. His elder brother Constantine had, as I said, forfeited his right to the throne. He had fallen in love with a charming Polish lady, the Countess Jeanette Grodzinski, after divorcing his first wife. As no amount of personal charm, not associated with royal blood, fitted a woman to occupy the throne of Elizabeth and Catherine, the Tsar had, in 1822, given him the alternative of losing either the lady or his right to the throne. Constantine had not a regal disposition. He married Jeanette and abdicated the right he had to the throne on the restored principle of inheritance. Nicholas knew of this abdication, though it was otherwise known only to a few intimate counselors. But he knew that there was much feeling against him in St. Petersburg, and he proceeded diplomatically. He proclaimed Constantine Tsar. Prince Golitsyn and others, who knew of the abdication, begged him to refrain until the council had opened a certain sealed letter which Alexander had left, but Nicholas persisted and sent word to his brother at Warsaw. Constantine refused the throne, and for several weeks letters went backward and forward. Nicholas was very much attached to his brother, but it is probable that he wanted time to study the threatening situation in St. Petersburg and secure the stability of his throne. He yielded on December 13th and fixed the following day for the taking of the oath of allegiance. On the 14th, a large body of troops and the customary crowd of citizens assembled in the square, and suddenly the cry, "Long live Constantine!" rang from the lips of various companies of the soldiers. "Long live the Constitution!" was also shouted, and it is said that the ignorant troops, who had been told to add this, thought that it was the name of Constantine's Polish wife. Nicholas, who did not lack courage, came out of the palace and endeavored quietly to convince the soldiers that his brother had abdicated. They repeated their cries, and the nucleus of mutineers began to grow and form a compact body. It is thought if those who had arranged the plot had had more courage, it might have succeeded. But Prince Trubetskoy, the leader, kept out of sight, and there was no vigorous direction. General Radovich approached the soldiers to reason with them, and was shot. The Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, his golden cross lifted high in the air, next addressed them, and he was contemptuously told to go home and mind his own business. The night was falling, and it was feared that under its cover a serious riot would occur. Nicholas ordered blank firing, and, when the rebels jeered, ordered grape shot, and the rebellion was over. After the burial of the victims came the inquiry, and it was thorough and protracted. 240 were arrested, and they included men of the highest rank in St. Petersburg and many officers of the army. Princes, counts, barons, and generals were on the list of the condemned. The 5 ringleaders, including 2 colonels of military distinction, were sentenced to be quartered, but the Tsar commuted the sentence to hanging. The death sentence had become so unusual in Russia that a bungling amateur made a horrible tragedy of the business. But those 5 first martyrs of the Russian people met their death with impressive dignity and courage. 31 were sentenced to be beheaded and were sent to the mines for life. 17 were condemned to the mines and had their sentences changed to 20 years imprisonment. Others went, with their wives and families, to Siberia or to remote provinces, and Tsar Nicholas I went to Moscow to be crowned. Nicholas was sufficiently intelligent to realize that this conspiracy of soldiers and nobles and intellectuals was now a thing in the annals of Russia. He had a very candid memorandum drawn up from the subversive literature which was taken with the conspirators, and he carefully studied the condition of Russia as they had seen it. The new Tsar had a type of mind entirely different from that of his brother. He had a clear, robust, and narrow intelligence, unclouded either by mysticism or moral hypocrisy. He seriously considered the evils of the empire, the corruption of officials, the arrears of payment which led to extortion, the heavy taxes, the parity of justice, the general squalor, and considered the evils of the empire. Ignorance, the state monopoly of drink, the shocking condition of the serfs, and so on. These things must be remedied, and they must be remedied by the God-appointed person, the Tsar. That was his attitude. In his coronation manifesto he said, quote, "The statutes of the land are gradually perfected, the faults corrected, the abuses remedied, not by insolent dreams of destruction, but from above." Unquote. The new Tsar was for, quote, "true enlightenment," unquote. Any other enlightenment, any unauthorized enlightener, must look out. That was the note of the early part of the reign of Nicholas I. Speransky was brought from his retirement and told to carry out the reforms he had projected. His older code of laws was not passed, but he was directed to codify the existing laws of Russia, which was something. There were not competent lawyers in Russia to ensure the proper administration of justice, and young men were sent abroad to study law. But no youth must go and acquire education abroad for any other purpose. No foreign teachers or tutors must be tolerated any more in Russia. No foreign ideas must be permitted to taint the purity of the docile Russian soul. No noble could remain abroad more than 5 years, and no commoner more than 3 years. A very rigorous and complete censorship was set up. All manuscripts, even the manuscripts of journalistic copy, must be revised before they reach the printer. Any that ventured to recommend the ideas which were in France leading up to the Revolution of 1830, and in England to the Reform Bill of 1832, were suppressed. Intellectual life must concern itself with the native contents of the Russian tradition. It was stifled. Russia was just at the stage of a literary renaissance, but it was directed into this channel, and as it was mainly artistic, it contrived to thrive on nationalist soil. Pushkin and Gogol wrote their famous stories and poems. Karamzin founded Russian history of the dynastic type. Young men like Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy began, at the end of the reign, to take up the artistic tradition. The national drama was advanced, but it was all genuinely Russian. The new theologies and philosophies and sciences of the West were banned. The censorship was moderated a little in 1830 when Prince Levin, a religious but cultivated man, became Minister of Education. For a time the anathema was confined to matters which had a plain political import. But after a few years a reactionary succeeded Prince Levin, and the task of preventing enlightenment was rigorously resumed. The second revolutionary wave was slowly spreading over Europe. The stupid and harsh dynasty of the French kings went forever. The reform of the parliamentary franchise was now won in England. An historic fight for freedom and knowledge was raging in Austria, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Everywhere it was this detestable new middle class which was assailing the old traditions. Young men of the working class today have little conception in how overwhelming a proportion the champions and martyrs of, quote, the people, unquote, in those sanguinary days belonged to the middle class. The task of rulers plainly was to check literature and the university life, which were manufacturing this intellectual middle class. Literature of a modern kind was entirely suppressed. The universities were watched by the police, the new secret police which Nicholas created as an instrument of the threatened autocracy, and controlled after a time by the clergy. The Slavophile creed was elevated to the rank of a philosophy. Against this bold scheme of human development, which the liberals were basing upon the philosophy of Hegel, the quote, sound, unquote, teachers pitted a very plausible static creed. It was, they said, the peculiar gift of the Russian soul to reconcile the jarring elements of life, which in the West created only discord. These new notions of democracy and evolution, which was just emerging from the pit in England, and rationalism only increased the misery of life. Look at the contrast of the restless proletariat of England or France and the Russian peasant. Self-absorption in love as taught by Russian Christianity, not self-assertion as taught by religious and political rationalism, was the creed to make people happy. The influence of the church was ardently enlisted. Nicholas was sincere. He read a page of the Bible every night to his wife, and liked to have sincere people about him. He got rid of our chief and the converted atheist Magnitsky, and he upheld the abbot Foti. The Bible Society was directed to return to England, and its property was confiscated. The Roman Catholic Church had made progress under the liberal Alexander. It was checked and its property confiscated. The secret police penetrated study and Bordeaux in search of traces of heresy. In Poland, 4.5 million Roman Catholics were, quote, converted, unquote, to the Orthodox Church. In Protestant Livonia, the Russian priests and officials did almost as they willed. School children were damped with holy water and oil, and counted members of the Orthodox Church. Presents of money and land settled the hesitating consciences of their parents. The Russian Church supported the autocracy and anathematized culture. All Russians must therefore belong to the Russian Church. It must not be supposed that this drastic campaign extinguished the light in Russia. It merely compelled men to hide their light underground, or to speak and write with discretion. A sullen and stern fight went on all the time. Once the Catholics of Poland and Hungary had tried to shut off Russia from the culture of the West, and they had eventually failed. Now the czars, who had torn down the barrier, would set up a barrier of their own. It had no greater chance of lasting success, though it did postpone the awakening of Russia. In the end, when a third revolutionary wave spread over Europe, Nicholas doubled his precautions. Not more than 300 students were allowed at each university. This was, quote, true enlightenment, unquote. But a nobler race was rising amidst the densely ignorant mass, and Nicholas I could not crush it. It may be asked what he did for the honest improvement of the country, which he had sincerely regarded as the task of his autocracy. Very little. To educate the mass of people was, of course, a mischievous delusion in the creed of Nicholas I. The spread of elementary education was either arrested or carefully controlled. Under Speransky's early influence, he appointed an official, Count Kiselev, to look after the 18 million serfs on the crown estates, and the official was a good man. Schools of a kind were established. The filthy and unhealthy habits of the people were partly corrected. In 1842, a serf was enabled by statute to purchase his freedom. In 1848, it was enacted that the serfs of an insolvent landowner might collectively purchase the estate. Nicholas encouraged nobles to free their serfs. Then came the French Revolution of 1848, with its echoes all over Europe, and Nicholas abandoned reform. Even within the limits of his own plan, he had rendered insignificant service in comparison with the task which the papers of the conspirators had impressed on him. The 30 years of his reign were occupied in fighting the light which from all sides now sought to penetrate the darkness of Russia. The wars which interrupted or accompanied the emperor's efforts do not properly concern us, but in some features they illustrate his personality and work. On this side also, the new morality of the Romanoffs was degenerating rapidly into casuistry. Alexander had sought neither war nor territory. The dynasty was converted from the brutal attitude which had put the quintessence of glory and conquest by the sword. Alexander interfered in European affairs only in the lofty interests of justice and civilization. Nicholas also was a lover of peace and justice, and on this plea he started, or resumed, the Russian policy of expansion southward, which has since cost Europe so much blood. As is well known, Nicholas had provocation. Indeed, until some other force can secure protection for the weak, it remains an act of chivalry for the strong to do battle for them. That at least was the almost universal sentiment in the earlier half of the 19th century, and we saw that the people of St. Petersburg bitterly blamed Alexander for not interfering on behalf of the Greeks. Nicholas at once took up the task that his brother had declined. Greeks and Serbs were trying to throw off the brutal tyranny of the Turk, and the Sultan had sent the most fanatical and least civilized of his soldiers to chastise the insolent Christians. Europe rang with the horror of the massacres, the mutilations, the rapes and burnings. It was assuredly the place of a monarch, who was of like creed to the Greeks and of the same blood as the Serbs, to demand justice for them, and Nicholas promptly demanded it. He bade the Sultan evacuate the Balkans and grant autonomy to his Christian provinces. England and France were equally moved by the outrages, and not a little jealous of any action of Russia, and the three powers gave the Sultan an ultimatum. His refusal to comply led to the destruction of his fleet at Navarino in 1828, and Greece won its independence. It was the beginning of the abominable international jealousy which has so long suffered the Turk to play the savage in Europe. The Sultan knew that Austria was sufficiently jealous of Russia to support him, and he believed that England was in the same frame of mind. He therefore sent a pompous complaint to Russia and demanded an indemnity. Nicholas, knowing well the jealousy of the other powers, baffled them by a straightforward inquiry whether he would not be justified in chastising the Turks. He would, he said, seize no territory in Europe, and would be content to reduce the Sultan merely to a decent sense of his duty to his Christian subjects. Austria trimmed in its reply, but England, France, and Prussia consented, and Nicholas led his legions southward. Again I refer to histories of Russia for the details of the 18 Months' War. It ended with the victory of Russia and the Treaty of Adrianople, September 14, 1829. Moldavia and Wallachia, now Romania, and Serbia were declared autonomous. The Dardanelles was open to Russian commerce. Russia secured an indemnity and the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. In the meantime, a new page had opened in the relations of Russia and Poland. The Grand Duke Constantine ruled the kingdom with more fierce than wisdom, and he begged his brother, who had not been crowned King of Poland, to come and impress the people of Warsaw by that ceremony. Nicholas went and swore to maintain the constitution which Alexander had granted the Poles in 1818. He made matters worse, however, by his arbitrariness. It was with difficulty that he could be induced to tolerate a service of thanksgiving in the Roman Catholic cathedral. He opened the Diet with a speech in French, and he usurped a function of the Diet in nominating senators. The discontent of the Poles, who had absorbed Western ideas, was greatly increased. It is said that there was a plot to kidnap the Tsar. At all events, the complaints in the Diet became so bitter that he closed it in violation of the Constitution, and the discontent ran to underground conspiracy. This plot was another element in the autocratic education of Nicholas I and his successors. In July 1830 occurred the Second French Revolution, followed by an insurrection at Berlin. Nicholas was so indignant that he thought of declaring war upon France, and he did offer troops to the King of Prussia. But at the end of September he was infuriated to learn that the spirit of revolt had spread to his own kingdom of Poland. Pro-Russians had been massacred, and an attempt had been made to capture the person of the Grand Duke, who had fled to Russia with his few troops. General Chilpicki and the Polish regiments had joined the revolutionaries. A provisional government, including Prince Czartoryski and Radziwill, had been established. In his sternest mood, Nicholas sent 120,000 men against the Poles, who hastily closed their intestine differences and gathered an army of 90,000 men. They fought with magnificent bravery, but the superior Russian forces wore them down and entered Warsaw, September 7, 1831. It suited the humor of Nicholas to suppress the rebellion, and the suppression, like the earlier partition, is one of the grim memories which lie between Poland and Russia today. After punishing the captured rebels, Nicholas went on to remove the very soil in which another rebellion might grow. He destroyed almost the last remnant of Polish nationality. The flag of the White Eagle was abolished, the Constitution torn up, the higher schools and universities closed. On February 26th, Poland was declared to be henceforth the province of Russia. At the other end of the empire, trouble in Georgia and Circassia gave occasion to strengthen in that direction the rule of the Tsar. He now reigned over the largest empire in Europe, and almost every other power, but especially England and France, regarded the growth of Russia with apprehension. Nicholas got the Dardanelles closed against foreign warships, and so secured his Black Sea coast against attack. He had assisted the Sultan to chastise one of his rebels, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, and was rewarded with this concession. Europe moved toward the Crimean War. First, however, Nicholas had an opportunity of crushing another revolt and chastising the supporters of the new ideas. The Third Revolutionary Wave, which was definitely to destroy the old political order in Europe, began in 1848, and it began, as usual, in France. Louis Napoleon, who was destined to give that country its last and not most fortunate experiment in kingship, made an appeal to Nicholas for friendship, if not alliance. But Nicholas liked neither an authority which was set up by the will of the people, nor a program that pandered to the will of the people. He rejected Napoleon's appeal and turned rather to Austria, where insurrection seemed to be well on the way to shake even the Habsburgs from the throne. The Hungarians were on the point of securing their independence, and the medieval system which Metternich had so long maintained was about to be destroyed. Nicholas gladly supported his brother autocrat. It was the Russian army of 190,000 men which propped up once more the tottering throne of the Habsburgs and prolonged the struggle of darkness against light. Nicholas would learn presently the utter selfishness and ungratefulness of Austrian policy, as his last successor would learn at a later date. The eyes of Nicholas were still upon the south, and the eyes of Europe were upon Nicholas. There can be very little doubt that the whole of the moralizing Romanoffs of the 19th century had, behind their professions of disintegrated regard for the victims of the Turk, a more or less clearly conceived design of gaining Constantinople and passing over the Balkans to the Mediterranean. Whatever sincerity there was in the zeal for the protection of the Christian subjects of the Sultan, they were far from insensible to the fact that these helpless Greek Christians occupied territory which would, if it were annexed, bring Russia at last to a free and warm sea. In Alexander this motive was so far checked by an effort and sincerity, that he would not interfere between the Greek and the Turk. He would be true to his later resolution to help no insurgents. Nicholas held an even sterner attitude toward insurgents, but the moment Christian subjects of the Sultan rose against their ruler, he entirely forgot that they were rebels against an hereditary autocracy. We shall find his successors equally lenient to rebellion in the Balkans, and it is scarcely a diplomatic secret that the Serbs, when they received the brotherly support of the last of the Romanoffs in 1914, looked silently and anxiously for a less disinterested purpose in the act of that monarch. Nicholas now had the Sultan almost in a state of vassalage, and it seemed to him that he had so far raised the prestige of Russia and won the gratitude of Austria that he need hardly consider the Western powers. Hence in 1853 he made a pompous objection when the Sultan granted the French certain privileges in regard to the Christians of Palestine. he sent Prince Menshikov to Constantinople to establish a definite Russian protectorate over all the Greek Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Secretly, however, Menshikov was to arrange an alliance with Turkey against France in case that power gave trouble, and the secret mission became known to the other powers. It has been the diplomatic pastime of the sultans for several generations to take advantage of the mutual jealousy of the Christian powers, such admirable lessons in virtue. Supported behind the scenes by the English ambassador, the Sultan refused the Russian proposals, and Nicholas decided upon war. He so little knew the secret action of England that he discussed with the English ambassador of St. Petersburg a plan for the division of the Ottoman Empire. England should, in the teeth of France, occupy Egypt, and Russia should take Constantinople. He at least expected England to be neutral. It may at least be said for England, which naturally did not care to see the Russian giant cast his shadow over Egypt and the route to India, that it tried earnestly to avert war. France was less pacific. It would like to see Russia in difficulties with England, and it secured an alliance with England to the extent of pressing upon the Tsar a round-table conference on the matters in dispute. The conference was held at Vienna, and a scheme of settlement was drawn up. The scheme was Sultan, supported by a growing feeling in his own country and an astute perception of the international jealousy, declined to accept without modification. And Russia refused to admit the modifications he suggested. Austria had played the Tsar false. In January 1854, the English and French fleets had entered the Black Sea. The Sultan had at the last moment signed the Vienna Note, and the Tsar had agreed to sign it with certain modifications. It was Austria that procured the rejection of these reserves. What came to be known as the Crimean War opened. Nicholas has been severely judged by some historians for his policy. The censure is easy for the historian who has before his eyes the issue as well as the commencement of the war. Russia was beaten and humiliated. After appalling sacrifices, she was compelled to sign a very disadvantageous peace, and her new prestige in Europe fell considerably. It is perhaps unfair to judge the man by the issue, but we may very well surmise that Nicholas did little more than cloak an aggressive design in the new mantle of righteousness which the Tsars affected. It was, as usual, the people who paid. The course of the war need not be described here. By a rapid assault, which was represented in France and England as a premature outrage, and did much to influence popular passion, the Russian fleet destroyed the Turkish, and the Russian armies descended south once more. Before the end of March, England and France declared war on Russia in alliance with the monarch who had for years reddened the soil of Greece and the Balkans with Christian blood. The language of the time reads curiously today. Nicholas issued a manifesto in which he warmly disclaimed any idea of conquest. He drew the sword, he said, only in defense of Christianity, and he was outraged to find France and England supporting the Mohammedan murderer. They must, he said, be jealous of Russia's prosperity and eager to destroy it. England frankly saying in its streets that it would never let the Russians get Constantinople. France openly used the same language, though there were those who said that Napoleon was personally irritated at the Tsar's haughty disdain of his credentials. The war soon centered upon the Crimea, and its historic milestones, Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, Sevastopol, are well known. It entered upon its second year, 1855, and the Russian people murmured bitterly. Nicholas himself must have felt the sting of many of the criticisms. During the long reign of his censors, when public opinion could not be brought to bear upon the administration, official corruption had increased, and both army and navy were far below the required standard of efficiency. Nicholas had isolated Russia from the West. Yet from the West had come every stimulus to the improvement of the Russian forces. He had reversed the policy of Peter and Catherine, and he seemed to be in danger of losing the lands they had taken. A terrible fire of criticism and invective was maintained at St. Petersburg. The censors controlled the press. Men circulated their views in manuscript. Nicholas was honest, and it is said that at times doubted if the policy to which he had devoted his life was sound. But he was stubborn, and he thrust aside all suggestions of peace. In the midst of the struggle he caught a chill which led to pneumonia. He died on March 3, 1855. Such was the opening of the last phase of the romance of the Romanoffs. The dynasty is sobered, not merely by the spirit of the age into which it has passed, but by the very impossibility of sustaining its gaieties. No monarch who showered the precious national revenues upon lovers or drinking comrades could long hold the throne in such an age. Insurrection has taken a new form. It is no longer the work of a coterie who would place a new monarch on the throne in order that they, the conspirators, may take the place of the late favorites in the golden reign. A new phrase, the rights of the people, is born or reborn in the world. A monarchy by the grace of God must do the work of God, not the work of the devil. Nicholas tries to reconcile the new and the old, the new idea of service and the old idea of autocracy. He will better the lot of the people, not because it is their will, but because it is his divine mission. And in order to protect his scheme, he constructs a new machinery of despotism, secret police and Cossacks and priests and censors and sophists. Against this machinery, we have now to see the Russian people bruise and crush their limbs until it and its autocratic makers are destroyed. First, however, one more effort will be made to pose as autocratic dispenser of justice and charity. The end of section 16, read by Jenny Cochran, West Vancouver, BC, Canada. Jenny Marie Cochran at gmail.com.
Section 17 of The Romance of the Romanoffs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A.J. Binney. The Romance of the Romanoffs by Joseph Martin McCabe. Chapter 14. The Tragedy of Alexander II. It is said that in his last year Nicholas I observed that he would leave a terrible burden to his son. He left a very costly war which turned monthly against Russia. He left an empty treasury and a privy purse that was 1,000,000 rubles in debt. He left a city and country that bitterly murmured against the rule which he had intended to make so benevolent. He left 40 millions of his people in the condition of serfdom which the whole of the remaining civilized world had outgrown. He left a nation outpaced industrially and commercially by every other power, because he could not admit into it the science which made the others superior. As he brooded over his Bible at night, he saw no solution. He died in distress, and, as in the case of the death of nearly every Romanoff, few mourned. His soil, Alexander II, who confidently took over the legacy, was much closer to Alexander I than to his father. He had the mediocre intellect of the dynasty after Peter I, but the sunny temperament of Catherine sobered. Unlike his father, who had listened only to the wrong teachers, Alexander II had been an exemplary pupil, and he had had good teachers. The new domestic atmosphere of the court is less interesting than the old, and we need not linger over it. The picture of Nicholas reading the Bible every night to his wife will suffice. The Tsarina was a model German Hausfrau on an imperial scale. Alexander breathed this atmosphere easily. He was an exemplary youth. On the night after the death of his father, he took the Bible to his mother's room and read to her. His chief tutor had learned teaching from Pestalozzi, and his lessons, which we have in part, were worthy of Marcus Aurelius. They were exalted in principle, if vague in application. Alexander was to make duty his star, his duty to his people and to civilization. He had travelled all over the empire, even in Siberia, and the sight of the exiles had so touched his warm heart that he had persuaded his stern father to modify the treatment even of some of the conspirators at his accession. What would a young monarch, Alexander was 37 years old, of this type make of the formidable problem which his father had created? We are quite prepared to hear that he is going to disarm rebellion and win his subjects by kindness. He will make the autocracy so beneficent that men will love it. A comparatively simple thing, the young man thought. But the tragedy of the life of Alexander II is that it was during his reign that nihilism arose, dagger in hand, and he himself fell by the bomb of an assassin who represented the people. Russian funds rose in the European market when Alexander II mounted the throne. He was well known, an amiable, kindly man, gently punctilious about etiquette, very sober in meat and drink, very cold to flatterers. Europe looked to him for peace. His people, who sank under their burdens, looked to him for relief. Liberals looked, not too confidently, to him for justice. But Alexander felt that his first duty was to bring the war not merely to an end, but a successful end. He would not be crowned until that was attained. A few weeks after the death of his father, he sent a representative to Vienna to take part in a peace conference. When France demanded that the Black Sea should be neutralized, and the naval strength of Russia limited by agreement, he refused, and he bade the war go on. It went on, as is known, until Sevastopol fell. and Russia soothed her feelings a little by taking cars. Then the diplomats gathered round a table to see what difference to the world the death of hundreds of thousands of men and the squandering of 3 nations' resources must make. There was in Russia no chance of disguising the defeat. The Black Sea was neutralized. All the ships and forts on which so much had been spent must go. Kars must be surrendered. The mouth of the Danube must be yielded. The protectorate of the Christian subjects of the Sultan must be abandoned. One war had put Turkey at the feet of Russia. Another war had put Turkey upon its own feet once more, and had set back Russia. It was, however, peace, and the country looked eagerly for the domestic program of the young Tsar. He was crowned in August 1856, and he at once disclosed his policy. He would, of course, maintain the work of his revered father, but it soon fell to pieces. An amnesty was granted, and the rebels came back to the sunlight. The military colonies of Arakchev were finally abandoned. Arrears of taxes to the extent of 24 million rubles were remitted to the impoverished people. The censorship was suspended, and St. Petersburg poured into liberalism like a stream when the dam is broken. The manuscripts that had passed stealthily from hand to hand and had been read behind locked doors were now sent to the press. Periodicals and pamphlets snowed upon the metropolis. Unions and leagues for everything new and beneficent and Western sprang up like mushrooms. All the talk of English radicalism filled the salons. Self-government and emancipation of women. Biblical criticism and Darwinism. Banks and railways and manufactures. Education and cooperation and political reform. Presently, the discussion would strike a deeper note. A certain Robert Owen of England had advocated a scheme which he called socialism. Certain Germans were beginning to take the germ of Owen's patriarchal theory and make a scientific system of it. Russia was now free to travel and to import books. The mind which has been artificially repressed will, if the process be not continued too long, expand more rapidly than the mind which has suffered to grow normally. In all this babble of humanitarian tongues, each reformer stridently denouncing his brother as a charlatan, as is the way of reformers, there was one steady and persistent note. Serfdom must be abolished. Here, the mass of the people agreed with the intellectuals. We are tempted to picture the great body of the Russian people as too stunted in mind, too dazed by labour and the stupefying conditions of their life to understand anything of this reform language. But there is plenty of evidence that they were quite alive to the idea of emancipation. They had looked to each new Tsar as he eloquently unfolded his lofty aims on Coronation Day to abolish serfdom. They looked with particular eagerness to Alexander. Constitution was too large a word for them, but they knew what it meant to be free, and to have their mir and their bit of land. 42.5 million people in Russia were still serfs in the year 1856, 9 centuries after the establishment of the Russian Church, 200 years after the beginning of the rule of the Romanoffs. I have, incidentally, given sufficient evidence in earlier chapters that this serfdom differed little from slavery. The peasant was, in polite phraseology, attached to the glebe. When a rich man ruined himself in the dissipations of St. Petersburg and sold his estates, he sold the peasants with the land. When a man opened new estates, he bought peasants to work it. They had no liberty of movement, which is the fundamental condition of liberty. They owned no land, except a small number who secured the advantages offered by the last 2 Tsars, and were therefore not masters of their own labour. Half their labour must be given gratuitously to their lord. This was the new, decent sort of serfdom, who would then allow them to wring a miserable living for themselves and family out of a fraction of his land with the other half of their time. Not much earlier, we saw great landowners, even women, could inflict on them such torture and death as few Romans are said to have inflicted on their slaves in the worst days of the empire. They were still slaves, though humanely treated on the crown lands, much as a wise farmer gives good conditions to his cattle. The lot of the peasant of Russia today is hard enough. Imagine it 60 years ago with the added yoke of serfdom. Assuredly, serfdom was the first and most monstrous evil to be removed, and we saw that for 50 years or more the rulers of Russia had been ashamed of this great stigma on their civilization. At the very beginning of the reign, the rumour went out that Alexander would free the serfs, and their wealthy owners were anxious. Alexander reassured them to some extent. He would like to see an end of serfdom, but it was an evil to be remedied gradually. He would like to see individuals reduce it by freeing their serfs. Soon after the close of the war, the Tsar again addressed the nobles and begged them to give serious attention to the emancipation of the serfs. It was plain that little would be done in this fashion, and a few months later he appointed provincial committees of landowners to give practical consideration to the problem. Historians seem to differ in discussing whether Alexander was moved by his own idealism or by the pressure of the growing liberalism of St. Petersburg and the clamours of the peasants. The point is of some interest in forming a general estimate of the Tsar emancipator. Professor Kornilov, while ascribing great reforms to Alexander II, maintains that he was impelled from without rather than within. That his moralizing tutor had not been a liberal or a man of definite social views, and had implanted in his mind only such general regard for humanity and justice as a conservative may profess. Others would represent the Tsar as a practical reformer of a liberal type, a little soured in the end by the excesses and violence of advanced people. Perhaps we are nearest to the truth if we picture Alexander II as a man who united a real detestation of serfdom with a sincere regard for justice in the abstract, yet would never have overcome the conservatism of many of his advisers and the immense practical difficulties, but for the very effective pressure put upon him by the rising impatience of educated Russians. Cathedral erected in Petrograd in memory of Alexander II. The provincial committees wasted many months in futile discussion and wrangling. Around them now waged a great battle of amateur sociologists, and half a dozen different theories of emancipation had their schools of defenders. There was, to begin with, a vital difference of views between the serfs and their owners. The peasant wanted land even more than liberty. The owner felt that it was emancipation to give liberty, and he was, as a rule, unwilling to part with land. There was the question of compensation, which inspired endless discussion. A serf was worth $100. In short, the committees of local owners did not want the work to proceed, and Alexander formed, at the beginning of 1857, a central committee of 12 members under his own presidency. The work was to be done from on high. Emancipation was to be a voluntary gift from the Tsar. The work still dragged. In 1855, Alexander had appointed the liberal Landskoy Minister of the Interior, and he zealously promoted the scheme and secured the liberal Miliutin as colleague. But other ministers were of the old school and unsympathetic. They pointed out that behind the demand for emancipation, other and more disturbing demands were becoming articulate. Liberal nobles, who were ready to emancipate their serfs already, claimed that this ought to be followed by their own political emancipation. They demanded a Duma. However, even members of the imperial family, like the Grand Duke Constantine, pressed for the reform, and the Tsar at length formed an imperial commission, on which the conservative opposition was checked. A law was drafted, and on February 19th, 1861, Alexander announced to Russia and the world, with a very natural exultation, that the serfs were to be freed. The serfs fell into three classes. Those on the crown lands were, as we saw, already in an improved condition. The law of 1861 did not affect them, but they were later, 1866, put in the same position as the emancipated serfs. Then there were 1.5 million serfs who were not on the land, but in personal service. These were ordered to continue their service for 2 further years, and they would then be free. The main body were the 21 million serfs on the estates of private owners. Each was now to own his house and the small strip of land encircling it, and the entire community of peasants in a village were to have, in common, a part of the arable land of the owner. The Slavophiles had secured this reversion to the primitive custom of owning in common, and one may justly suspect that they felt that the arrangement would make the peasants more or less impervious to the new ideas about property which were being imported from Germany. The mir was re-established, but the landowners were to sell, not give, their land, and they were to be compensated for the loss of serf labour. The entire valley was estimated, the state paid it, and the peasants were to refund the sum within a space of 49 years. The mir was responsible for the payments. Alexander looked out upon his empire for the signs of jubilation, and at first he saw many. Even so drastic a rebel as Herzen rejoiced. The journals and pamphlets of the metropolis turned from acidity to a temporary sweetness. Deputations of peasants, carefully chosen, were brought to thank the Tsar, and in the tearful accents of the aged serfs, he thought that he heard the voice of 20 millions. But it was not long before the reaction began, and a chill affected the liberalism of the Tsar. It was a very general belief of the peasants that the land belonged by ancient right to them, and it had been in some way stolen from them by the wealthy and noble. When, therefore, they heard of the scheme of compensation, the payments which must be made annually until the death of the youngest of them, they began to murmur. The officials, they said in many places, must have falsified the words of the Tsar. There were other grievances. The allowance of land each had, in the heat of discussion, been cut down to very small proportions. The owners were not bound to sell even this, and in many places they refused, and, where they sold, they generally attempted to sell inferior land. Officials, charged with the administration of the law, took bribes, and there was a vast amount of foul play. In fine, the emancipated serfs now found that a free man had to shoulder a burden of taxes heavier than they had imagined. In short, hopes had been improperly inflated, and the disillusion was exasperating. Nor was there now any lack of men imbued with the new ideas who fostered the discontent. Lanskoy and Milyutin were dismissed from office through the intrigue of the Conservatives, and the new minister, Valuyev, had not the same scrupulous regard for the success of the law. In various places there were risings of the peasants, and the troops had to use their muskets. In the government of Kazan, 10,000 peasants revolted under the lead of Anton Petrov, and the new era was stained heavily with blood. Petrov was executed. 80 of the emancipated serfs were shot with arms in their hands. At the University of Kazan, the students boldly held a requiem service in honor of the dead, and Alexander had to punish even the monks who celebrated it. The Tsar Emancipator did not long enjoy his popularity. The clouds closed slowly after the short burst of sunshine, and would cover the skies of Russia henceforward until the last Romanoff quitted the throne. An even graver cause of distrust now arose. Alexander had visited Poland soon after his accession, and had paternally promised to make the Poles happy, if they were good. No more dreams, he said genially to them. His father's work was to be maintained, he told them. Poland was to be a province of Russia. He appointed a moderate governor, Prince Gorbachev, and declared an amnesty. Since the terrible repression of the rebellion by Nicholas I, a large number of Poles had lived in the various capitals of Europe, and there they had been thoroughly educated in modern ideas. In London, particularly, they had been steeped in the sober radicalism that had followed the failure of the Chartist movement, the fervour for the deliverance of Hungarians and Italians, the popular indignation against Russia. Most of them would not return to a Poland which was not free, but some did, and they assisted in the education of the Poles. There arose a very general cry among the educated Poles for a constitution, and Alexander believed no more than his fathers, or than Pius IX, in giving a constitution that was asked as a right. In November 1860, a great demonstration was held in memory of the Revolution of 1830, and the authorities were annoyed. Demonstrations increased for all kinds of undesirable objects, and the troops at Warsaw fired and killed 5 Poles. A vast crowd of 100,000 attended the funeral. The Tsar tried to conciliate them by small gifts. He appointed a Polish director of public instruction and cults. He created municipal councils for the large towns, and electoral councils for each government and district. But he would not grant a constitution, and the agitation increased. A great crowd went to the Viceroy's palace to formulate their demands, and soon 200 of them lay dead upon the pavement. The whole city went into mourning. A new Viceroy, General Lambert, was appointed, and the Tsar instructed him to carry out conscientiously the reforms he had promised. But the officials who were to carry them out were Russians, and the greater reforms were withheld. There were further demonstrations and further shootings. A reactionary soldier, Count Ludus, was then made viceroy. His life was attempted. The Poles now openly demanded independence and a restoration of Lithuania. Arrests and banishment were useless. The whole educated nation seemed to be aflame. So on January 15th, the authorities decided to decimate the enthusiasts by an enforced recruiting for the army, and Poland entered upon another futile rebellion. Those who escaped the police fled to the country, secured arms, and formed guerrilla bands. It was one of the most pathetic of rebellions. The insurgents had no artillery, no transport, or medical service. They moved about, often led by priests as they were hunted, living on the sympathetic gentry and peasants, occasionally hanging or shooting a pro-Russian landowner. It was not war, and the Russian troops hanged or shot all they captured. The most curious feature of it was that a secret committee or council guided the insurrection, levied taxes, and issued decrees from the University of Warsaw itself without being detected by the police. Poles abroad fierily preached the wrongs of their countrymen, and the English, French, and Austrian governments formally requested the Tsar, 1863, to put an end to the anarchy. 2 months later, they formulated for the Tsar what seemed to them the reasonable demands of the Poles: a general amnesty, parliamentary representation, reform of the law of recruiting, complete liberty of religion, admission of Poles to office, and so on. Alexander indignantly refused. He did not add, one wonders if he reflected, that it was precisely because the Sultan would not grant such rights to his Christian subjects that Russia had made war upon the Turk. Prussia supported and promised assistance to the Tsar. The last sparks of the rebellion were stamped out in May 1864, and the punishment began. The few traces that Nicholas had left of a Polish nationality were now destroyed. The Polish language was banned from schools and universities, and the chief rebels were executed. It was the nobles, the educated class, that Alexander chiefly blamed, and it was on that account that he granted the peasants of Poland the right to share the land. Alexander was less to blame in connection with another event, 2 years later, which moved Europe to express its indignation. The settlement of the Caucasic region was completed, and some hundreds of thousands of Mohammedan Circassians and Georgians migrated from the occupied territory and sought shelter in Turkey. The English government again made a protest at St. Petersburg, which was neatly countered by the reminder that the state of Ireland hardly justified England in posing as a moralist. The Circassians were in fact handsome ruffians with whose ways the English were imperfectly acquainted. They freely sold their daughters, the famous Circassian maids, to the harems of Constantinople, and they were the most expert cattle thieves and least industrious workers of Europe or Asia. They were largely settled by the Turks on the farms of the reluctant Bulgarians, and they willingly joined the Bashi-Bazouks in cutting off Christian ears. The brutality that was used in the suppression of the Polish insurrection reacted upon the intellectuals of St. Petersburg, just as the insurrection itself reacted upon the more or less benevolent designs of the Tsar. But before we consider how the reign of Alexander II came to inaugurate the terror which would for the next 60 years brood over Russia, it is proper that we should briefly examine the remainder of his reforms. The emancipation of the serfs, though a measure of elementary justice that had been too long denied, must nevertheless command our admiration when we consider the stubborn opposition which the Tsar had to overcome. It was not followed by the political emancipation of the nation at large, but the Tsar created a popular institution which would, at a later date, prove a valuable instrument of reform. The mir was re-established by the communal ownership of the land. The district council, the Zemstvo, was now established, 1864. Each government, or province, of Russia was already divided into districts, and there was to be in each of these a Zemstvo, or popular council, formed of deputies who were elected for a term of 3 years. They included representatives of the landowners, the artisans, and the peasants, and were to meet at least once a year with a permanent executive committee. A general Zemstvo for each province was also created. At the time, the Zemstvo had, insofar as it was obliged to act, few and simple functions: the care of roads, bridges, sanitation, etc., and the imperial taxes were so heavy that it could not raise sufficient money for other work. The imperial government, moreover, jealously watched and often interfered with the work of the popular council. Yet it was an important installment of reform, and at a later date we shall find the Zemstvo playing a greater part than the Tsar intended in the enlightenment and emancipation of Russia. Already it had the option of building schools, and in many places it did so. There was a corresponding improvement in the administration of justice. The slovenly and corrupt traditional system was condemned, and an entire series of new tribunals framed on Western models was created. There was a court for each district and a court of appeal, from which a final appeal for revision might be made to the Senate. On the French model, the magistrates were to conduct the preliminary inquiry which had hitherto been left, with disastrous results, to the police, and public trial by jury was introduced. In the rural districts, justices of the peace, who were generally large landed proprietors, heard the petty cases which had earlier been made a matter of rough justice, or injustice, between the serf and his master. In such cases, an appeal might be made to a bench of justices if there was a question of a fine of more than 30 rubles, $15, or more than 3 days' imprisonment. Such appeals were rare, as it was found that the hardy peasant preferred a few strokes of the lash, as in the old days, to a loss of his money or his time. In the higher courts, as well as in the army, flogging was abolished. Here again, the demands of the Liberals were, in theory, generously met, and in practice, they were largely evaded. Incompetence was inevitable at the beginning of so large a reform, and some degree of ill will and abuse of power had to be expected. These defects do not detract from the merit of the Tsar and his liberal ministers. But there was from the first a tendency on the part of the imperial government to regard cases as political, and reserve them for the kind of treatment they had always received. As the radical agitation grew, and the Tsar was driven into the arms of the reactionaries at the court, this interference naturally increased. Long before the end of Alexander's reign, the civil courts were habitually ignored in precisely those cases which needed the most impartial consideration, and men were detained and punished in thousands at the whim of brutal and irresponsible servants of the autocracy. These were the principal measures of reform granted by Alexander II in his period of benevolence. With the fiscal improvements, we are not much concerned, but it may be noted that for a time a budget was published. Much was done in those early years, 1861 to 1866, for education. The restriction upon the number of students attending the universities was removed, and there was a remarkable eagerness to obtain higher education. Youths earned their living while they attended the classes, and some scholarships were founded. Girls were excluded from the universities, but we shall see presently how they broke through the barriers and joined the youths of Russia in their demand for enlightenment. A large number of secondary and elementary schools were established. In 1877, it was claimed that there were 25,000 schools. The press was offered the alternative of submitting its copy to a censorship or risking the attentions of the police. The very name of censor was hated after the experience under Nicholas I, and for a time periodicals and books poured out upon an eager public. The restriction upon travel also was removed, and men passed freely to the outer world, which terrified the Slavophiles, and came back with the language of Mazzini and other apostles upon their lips. Foreigners in Russia received civil rights for the first time. The restrictions upon the movements of the Jews were modified, though the Pale was not abolished. The history of that stirring period has been so frequently written in the last 30 years that we no longer profess to find a mystery in the fact that this reforming Romanoff fell by the hand of an assassin. Here it is necessary only to give a short summary of the development after 1860 which entirely changed the character of his reign. We must remember that from the first, Alexander II did not recognize the rights of man. In his best and most benevolent mood, he was concerned only with the duties of monarchs. The authority divinely entrusted to him was accompanied by a divine mandate to make his people virtuous and happy. Within the limits of a strict maintenance of the authority of the autocracy and of the clergy, he would do so. The more enlightened of his subjects might respectfully offer suggestions, though that was properly the function of the ministers he chose to guide him. But the correct attitude of the people was to await, in patience and respect, the measures of reform which the wisdom of his council sanctioned him in granting. This was a fundamental anachronism, and however generous the intentions of the Tsar may have been, and however misguided and exaggerated some of the radicals, a conflict was as inevitable as the sunrise. Seeing that the policy of his early liberal ministers did not pacify the country, which became louder and bolder in its demands the more he gave it, Alexander fell back upon the worn maxims of autocracy and surrounded himself more and more with reactionaries. The wealth of the great landowners and the power of the clergy and monks were as much threatened by the new spirit as was the autocracy of the czars. In the recesses of the court there was, therefore, a complacent agreement upon the kind of theory which has at all times reconciled the consciences of good men with persecution. The extremists, it was said, were few in number and morbid or perverse in sentiment. They must not be suffered to abuse liberty to the detriment of the nation. Coercion was justified. To coercion, which meant, in practice, the most wanton brutality and violence on the part of baffled police, some replied with violence. In effect, war was declared. The crowd of young men who flocked to the University of St. Petersburg when the restrictions were removed were the nucleus of the radical movement, which was gradually raised to revolutionary heat. The teaching of liberal professors, who were reconciled to gradual and moderate reforms, only prepared them for a more highly seasoned political diet, and there were powerful writers to purvey it. Herzen, who was in exile, sent his propaganda into the country much as Mazzini taught the youth of Italy. His very radical organ, the bell, was the delight of the young folk, who, in all ages, scorn the timidity of age, and are convinced that the immaturity of the youthful mind is amply compensated by its superior candour. Bakunin, who for a time joined Herzen in London and then settled in Switzerland, taught a gospel which gradually approached, and finally reached, anarchy. Tchaikovsky, who was also compelled to leave Russia, was the inspiration of a circle or discussion society at St. Petersburg, which had branches or affiliated societies in every town of Russia. Belinsky and other radicals assisted the ferment of emotions and philosophies. Kropotkin and Stepyak were coming upon the scene. We have seen how the mind of Russian youth was prepared for these advanced gospels. The monotonous misery and poverty of the country in spite of every change of ruler. The corruption and brutality of officials. The harsh measures of Nicholas I. The disastrous issue of the Crimean War. The severity of the repression of the Poles. The disappointing results of the emancipation of the serfs, and the increasing perception that Russia lagged behind every other country in Europe, put a mass of inflammable material into the minds of the educated. As early as 1862, a student was caught spreading a pamphlet in which he advocated a bloody revolution against the dynasty, and was exiled to Siberia. In the same year, a series of mysterious fires in St. Petersburg increased the agitation. Conservatives ascribed them to the violent radicals. The radicals retorted that they were due to agents of the reactionaries who wanted to provide a ground for stringent action. The left wing of the reformers moved rapidly further west, and its language increased in violence. The authorities raised the fees at the universities and endeavoured to suppress the numerous student societies, but the agitation continued. Many of the nobles themselves were in sympathy with the intellectual revolt. In 1862, several gatherings of nobles and gentry passed a demand for parliamentary institutions. At the other end of the movement, the conviction increased that no form of centralized government would remain honest and disinterested, and the philosophy of anarchy was framed. At first, it was moral rather than political, as it is in the minds of many anarchists today. The individual was to be relieved of the swathing bonds of all religious and moral and other traditions, and the theory was that he would then develop healthily. To this theory was first applied the name nihilism, which was afterwards, as anarchy became more and more political in complexion, extended to the whole revolutionary movement, though socialism gained considerably on anarchy as time went on. It was the period of Karl Marx and the early German socialists, and the imposing structure of Marx's argument won large numbers of adherents. One of the most disturbing features in the minds of conservatives was the way in which young women adopted the advanced creed. The attempts of Peter the Great to break down the barriers which confined the life of women had almost ceased at his death. In the world of wealth, as Tolstoy's novels show, women kept the liberty of the reigns of Elizabeth and Catherine. The new austerity of the court was not accompanied by any general asceticism amongst the aristocracy. The philosophy of anarchy provided a principle for what had hitherto been an inconsistent defiance of religious traditions which were nominally respected. But the mass of Russian women and girls, above the level of the peasantry, had hitherto been unaffected by these liberties of the aristocracy. Now the cry of the emancipation of woman penetrated remote country houses, and many a girl broke loose from the control of a tearful mother or an infuriated father, and sought the centre of enlightenment in the city. The authorities refused to allow unmarried women to attend the higher schools. They retorted, as Roman women had done nearly 2,000 years before, by entering into fictitious marriages. Gradually, they won the right to attend certain lectures at the university, and many of them were found in the student circles where the reconstruction of the universe was heatedly discussed. The next development was that the intellectuals decided to educate the workers. An officer of the army resigned his commission and turned weaver. Sofia Perovskaya and other daughters of wealthy parents got into touch with the working and domestic women. The police of the third section, the secret police created by Nicholas, grew in numbers and dogged the steps of these fiery young apostles. In 1866, a man named Karakosov, who had formed a society to promote the welfare of the people, attempted to shoot the Tsar. An isolated fanatic, the Tsar was told, and at that time there was certainly no real organization of assassination. But the pressure of the police and the daily risk of arrest drove the agitation underground, and to their new quarters the spies and informers and police followed them. There was now, plainly, no question of persuading Alexander II to complete his scheme of reform. There was increasing question of making war upon him and the autocracy. It was the Russian tradition. When a Tsar was obnoxious, you removed him. But to do so in the name of justice, not in the name of a covetous group of courtiers, was revolution of the worst order. By this time, the early 70s, the Tsar saw that he had not merely to deal with a few unbalanced individuals. The jails were full of political prisoners. All the well-known leaders were in jail or exile, yet the work proceeded amazingly. In 1874, there were 1,500 arrests. The new courts were not called upon to decide the guilt of the prisoners. They were knouted or thrust into prison or sent to Siberia. Large numbers died in the overcrowded jails. Some went insane or committed suicide. When the experiment of a public trial was at last made, in 1877, people were amazed at the calm courage and high idealism of the young criminals. In 1878, nearly 200 of them were tried. Many received terms of imprisonment or penal servitude of from 10 to 20 years. The rebels were now at war with the brutal ministers of the autocracy, and they began to use the same weapons. A young girl from the country came to St. Petersburg and shot the head of the police, and, amid great enthusiasm, she was acquitted by a jury. Another head of the police was in the same year, 1878, stabbed at Odessa. Spies were shot. Groups of young men who were surprised in secret council by the police produced revolvers and fought. The governor of Kharkov, who treated political prisoners with great brutality, was assassinated. Another attempt was made to shoot the Tsar, 1879. In the meantime, it will be remembered, the Russo-Turkish War had occurred, and it had the customary effect of increasing the people's burden and their discontent. The Slavophile party naturally gave birth to a pan-Slav party, and the traditional Russian ambition to spread over the Balkans was revived. The Turks continued to treat their Balkan subjects with great brutality, and in 1874 Bosnia and Herzegovina broke into revolt, while Serbia and Montenegro, which were semi-independent, joined with their compatriots in the war. The Pan-Slavs now pressed for war, and there were those in the Tsar's circle, such as his brother, the Grand Duke Nicholas, who warmly supported the agitation. The finance minister, on the other hand, who had carefully nursed the treasury into something like prosperity, strongly opposed the adventure. The Tsar wavered between his hopes of getting the ignominious Treaty of 1856 set aside, and his love of peace and dread of the costly chances of war. There is no doubt that Bismarck helped to urge him to war. Alexander was pro-German, and had in 1870 secured the neutrality of Austria while Prussia attacked France. It is true that when the Germans mediated a fresh attack upon the French in 1875, the Tsar interfered on behalf of France and greatly angered Bismarck. That statesman, however, retained influence at St. Petersburg, and on the Federation tradition of encouraging rivals to wear each other out, he urged Russia to attack Turkey. In 1877, April, Russia entered the war, and its progress was so rapid that in the following March it compelled Turkey to sign the humiliating Treaty of San Stefano. Russia took from it very little territory directly, but besides securing the recognition of the complete independence of Serbia and Romania, it created a large principality of Bulgaria in which it hoped to have a predominant interest. England was, unfortunately, still in its mood of favouring the Turk through jealousy of Russia, and Austria was less openly hostile. A desultory war continued, and Bismarck astutely offered the services of Germany as mediator, with the intention of curtailing its gains. By the Treaty of Berlin, July 13th, 1878, the San Stefano Treaty was torn up, and Bulgaria was cut down by half. Once more, a costly war had, in the eyes of the people, done little for Russia, and there was the customary and not unjust cry that the course of the war had revealed a great deal of official corruption. The tragedy of the reign of Alexander ran on to its ghastly finale. In 1878, it was decreed that in future political prisoners should be tried by courts martial, and in the following year the Tsar appointed governors general of St. Petersburg, Kharkov, and Odessa, and gave additional and formidable powers to the governors of Moscow, Warsaw, and Kiev. The system of repression was to be drastically pursued. The revolutionaries retorted by attempting to blow up the train in which Alexander returned from a visit to the Crimea. 3 mines were laid. Near Moscow, Sofia Petrovskaya and a few associates had worked for 2 months digging a tunnel to the line from a house they had taken. The preparations were in this case perfect, but the Tsar escaped. The police had arranged 3 trains, and as the Tsar changed train on approaching Moscow, leaving the middle for the first train, he was allowed to pass unharmed, and it was the second train that was blown to pieces. Sofia Petrovskaya and her associates escaped and returned to their plotting. The heads of the revolutionary movement had decreed the death of Alexander II. For the next 15 months, there was a thrilling war between the revolutionaries and the Third Section. Time and again, the Tsar's advisers declared that only a few dozen rebels were left, and the country was substantially loyal. But, although hundreds were arrested annually, though bribes and spies and all the ignominious machinery of the police were brought into play, the Red Terror held the field against the White Terror. In February 1880, not only the Tsar, but all the imperial family had a narrow escape. A revolutionary named Halturin entered the service of the Winter Palace as waiter. He discovered that the waiters' quarters were, with an intervening floor occupied by troops, directly underneath the dining room, and he proposed to fire a mine there. Day by day, he smuggled into the palace small quantities of dynamite and stored them with his belongings. The police discovered a plan on which the imperial dining room was marked with a cross, and they searched the floors beneath it. They did not find the explosive, but from that day a stricter watch was kept, and no more dynamite could be introduced. Halturin believed that he had enough, and on February 17th he fired the mine at a time when the imperial family ought to be assembled for a festive dinner. But the Tsar was late for dinner, and again he escaped unhurt. The closing scene is one of dramatic interest. It was decided to lay a mine under a street through which the Tsar had frequently to pass near the palace, and at the same time station men with special bombs to throw at the carriage in case the mine failed. The conspirators hired a shop, and while some of them conducted a brisk and honest trade in eggs and butter, others tunnelled beneath the street. The soil was removed in the empty boxes, and though the police several times visited the shop, they detected nothing beyond a popular grocery business. The tunnel was complete and the mine ready about the middle of March 1881. The dramatic feature is that meantime, Alexander II was being induced to consider proposals of reform. He had, after the outrage at the palace, removed the Governor-General of St. Petersburg and entrusted the repression of anarchy to a supreme commanding commission. The leading spirit of this was General Loris Melikov, who had had some success as Governor-General of Kharkov. Melikov's method was to isolate the terrorists by grinding reforms which would conciliate the general body of malcontents. He pressed this method upon the Tsar, as Alexander, distracted and weary, perhaps a little anxious about his life, decided to try it. The prisons and the settlements of Siberia were explored, and large numbers were restored to their homes. About 2,000 students were permitted to return to the universities and the scholarships were restored. Melikov then proposed a scheme of popular representation which, though it did not exactly give Russia a constitution, might have conciliated many. The reactionary ministers and courtiers now doubled their efforts to restrain the Tsar, but he accepted Melikov's draft and kept it several days for revision. He probably wavered and postponed the fatal decision, and it was during that week of delay that the conspirators completed their preparations. On March 16th, Alexander read the draft to his ministers and approved it. His relief at having reached a definite policy was great, and in happier mood he drove out to review his troops. As he returned to the palace, a young woman in the street waved her handkerchief. She was the redoubtable Sofia Perovskaya, and was giving the signal. A bomb was thrown, and the carriage was wrapped in a cloud of smoke, while Cossacks writhed on the ground. But out of the smoke and litter the Tsar again emerged unhurt. Against the advice of his officers he lingered to say a word to the wounded, and it is said that he congratulated himself on his escape. "It is too early to congratulate yourself," said a young man who, through some oversight, had been permitted to approach. He flung his bomb, and the Tsar fell, fearfully and mortally wounded. He died at the palace 2 hours later. "They who draw the sword shall perish by the sword," the rebels grimly commented. The doctrine of the assassination of tyrants, of men who stifled constitutional demands by the shedding of blood, was then held by even moderate radicals in many lands. There were others who pointed out that Alexander II, who had inherited an empty purse, left many millions of rubles to be divided amongst his family. End of section 17. Recording by A.J. Binney.
Section 18 of the Romance of the Romanoffs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 15. Enter Pobiedonostseff. The Romance of the Romanoffs has now passed the phase of comparative dullness, which set in with the conversion of the dynasty from its license of personal conduct and has entered upon its final stage of mingled melodrama and tragedy. The Russian people is awakening to a consciousness that what some call an autocracy by divine right is a foreign intrusion into the life of the Slavs, an infringement of the rights of men. 3 ways of meeting the crisis were open to the new emperor, Alexander III. He might grant the full constitutional liberty that had now been won in every civilization of the world except China. He might follow the course traced by Melikov and prolong the life of the dynasty. He might prefer to extinguish every demand and insist upon an adulterated autocracy. Alexander III chose, with such modifications as his vacillations allowed, the third course. He was the second son of Alexander II. The eldest son had died in 1865 of consumption, but Alexander was a man of exceptionally strong constitution. There is a tradition that he could take a horseshoe in his mighty hand and bend it until the points touched. Such a youth would make a fine soldier, and as a soldier he was trained. He was cool, courageous, as he showed on various occasions, regular in life, sincerely religious, and very little cultivated. When his brother died, he had to be prepared for the business of ruling a very unruly empire, but he was now 20 years old, dull in intellect, and altogether indisposed to acquire the varied culture which his future required. One of his tutors was the famous Pobiedonostseff, who was not at the time a pronounced reactionary, but his office prepared the way for power in his reactionary days. It is said that his wife, the Princess Dagmar of Denmark, induced him to prepare more carefully for the throne, but that seems to be a legend of the court. All that men knew about him was that he liked soldiering and music, and patronized historical research, and thought that there were far too many Germans in Russia. On this last feature, some built a faint hope. Germany was now an empire, and the League of the 3 Emperors, Germany, Austria, and Russia, boded no good for democracy. Bismarck encouraged both the policy of repression in Russia and the policy of aggression abroad because he did not wish to see Russia develop her mighty resources. On the other hand, Alexander was a soldier, a man steeped in the Romanov tradition of divine autocracy and entirely out of sympathy with humanitarian or progressive ideas. The only question was whether from policy he would follow the lead of Milikov. When the oath of allegiance was taken, he announced ambiguously that he would walk in the steps of his father. Which set of steps? Milikov showed him the draft of a pseudo-constitution initialed by the late Tsar. There will be no change, he said. But men were uncertain. The fearful end of his father must have embittered him. The rebels were, of course, drastically punished. 800 more arrests were made. Sofia Perovskaya, the wonderful woman of those bloody days, and 4 others were executed. There is a grounded suspicion that they were first tortured. Another woman was condemned, but she was pregnant, and her sentence was changed to exile. It is thought by many that an injudicious step taken by the revolutionaries helped to fix the Tsar's plan. They somehow got into his hands a long letter or manifesto in which, while pleading for reform, they very plainly held a sword over his head, and their demands were not at all moderate. I doubt if Alexander III ever hesitated. His strong and narrow mind and soldierly attitude disposed him to enforce discipline. Pobiedonostseff was soon at his side. He was procurator of the Holy Synod. Since the preceding year, when Milikov's scheme was brought forward for discussion, he bitterly opposed it and predicted that it would ruin Russia. He was now a Russophile of the narrowest and most fanatical description. Alexander leaned to that side. The German emperor had, he said, warned his father against making any concessions to constitutionalism. The Holy League, a fanatical Russophile society led by the Grand Duke Vladimir, pressed for coercion. Out of the struggle there emerged at last, on April 29th, the new Tsar's message to his people. It was probably written by Pobiedonostseff. In it, Alexander firmly contended that the autocracy was of divine origin, and he would protect it against all encroachments. But the reforms granted by his father would not be withdrawn. Education, popular councils, municipal institutions, and so on were to be maintained. The people were to be admitted to some share in the management of the empire's affairs. That was to be the note of the new reign, something more moderate than Pobiedonostseff and less advanced than Milikov. Milikov resigned, and his place as Minister of the Interior was taken by General Ignatieff, a man of moderate conservative views, or a man who at least felt the need of concessions. On the one hand, he looked with criminal toleration upon the massacres of the Jews which now broke out all over Russia. On the other, he advised the Tsar that large reforms were needed. The peasants were assisted in paying off the crippling annual interest on their emancipation. Popular councils were set up in Poland, Siberia, and the Baltic provinces, which had not hitherto had them. Above all, he devised and imposed upon the Tsar a feeble pretense of a national parliament. Members of the provincial councils, informed men, as they were diplomatically called, were gathered into a deliberating assembly at St. Petersburg, and it was through them that the reforms were gradually drafted. There was an improvement in the harsh manner of collecting the taxes, and the burden was shifted a little more on the shoulders of the wealthy. Ranks were opened for the peasants. The conservatives stormed the Tsar with protests against these dangerous concessions, and in the spring of 1882, General Ignatieff was forced to retire. His place was taken by Count Dmitry Tolstoy, one of the men of the last reign whom liberals hated above all others. He had been the Minister of Education during the late Tsar's drastic restriction of the schools and universities. He and Pobiedonostseff and a few other rabid Slavophiles now closed round Alexander III and dictated the policy of his reign. That policy was one of, at home, unswerving, unscrupulous, unmerciful Russification, that is to say, complete obliteration of all criticism of the autocracy in native Russia and all religious or racial characters in the subject provinces of alien race or religion. Abroad, the policy was naturally pan-Slav, aggressive, imperialistic, but here the emperor, in his limited resources, curbed the fanatics, so that the reign passed without a war. Russia was orientated for the final struggle in the next reign. For the reign of Alexander, we need only glance at the various branches of the machinery of despotism which was created for the defense of the Romanoffs. Education was the great source of evil, but in a world where education was now adopted as an elementary principle of civilization, it was no longer possible to return to the absolute illiteracy of the Middle Ages. A compromise was found in the easy distinction between sound and unsound education. The figures of educational progress during the reign of Alexander III are at first sight impressive. In 1877, the 8 universities had 5,629 students. In 1886, the number had risen to 14,000. In the same period, the number of high schools rose from 200 to about 1,000. The number of elementary schools from 25,077 to 35,517. There were now, in all, more than 2 million pupils in the elementary schools of the empire. It should be added that the population of the empire was now 113 million, that most of the schools were founded independently of St. Petersburg by the zealous Zemstvos, and that very many of them were mere huts or sheds with ludicrously incompetent teachers. Count Tolstoy, having been for 16 years Minister of Education, controlled this department in the interest of Slavophiles and imperialists. Pobiedonostseff indeed wanted to have all the elementary schools put under the control of the Holy Synod, or under the clergy. I have said little about the Russian Church during this period for a reason which will be understood. It was a mere docile instrument of the dynasty. Its ordinary priests were rough, ignorant men, little superior to the peasants themselves. Its higher clergy murmured not one single syllable at the cruelty, just as they had murmured none at the earlier vices of the Romanoffs. The Zemstvos, however, in most cases refused to hand over their schools, and the secular part of the government had neither the funds to devote to the work nor the wish to have serious trouble with the Zemstvos. We shall see that they found it easier to capture the Zemstvos themselves and control their action. The Holy Synod also began the policy of creating religious schools in opposition to those of Zemstvos, and secure an imperial favor for these nurseries of docility. The high schools were remodeled and were now forbidden by law to admit the children of the poorer types of workers. Some technical improvements were made in them, but the general effect was to reduce the stimulating influence of the education. The universities were more drastically controlled. No students' societies were permitted, and the curriculum was carefully purged. Inspectors were attached to them, and the grant of scholarships was made to depend upon the reports of these spies of orthodoxy. There were serious riots of students in 1882 and 1887, but the energy of the reactionary officials gradually drove professors into silence or exile and pupils into subjection. The press was in 1882 controlled by temporary rules, which proved to have a long duration. If a journal had, after 3 warnings, incurred suspension, it must, at the expiration of the term, henceforward submit a copy of the next day's issue to the censors before 11 at night. This effectively silenced the majority of the liberal periodicals and eviscerated the others. When some tried to evade the gag by using language of a veiled or ambiguous character, a junta of 4 ministers was empowered to suppress any periodical which seemed to them to have a mischievous tendency. By these and other means, progressive literature was extinguished. The few revolutionaries continued, of course, to establish private presses, which were constantly detected in the workers sent to Siberia or the mines. But the work of political education was generally suspended. The political scheme which had been set up was similarly revised. The Zemstvos were, as I said, stubborn. Even the nobles were jealous of their local powers. and at first antagonistic to the new regime. Large numbers of them were won by stories of dangerous tendencies amongst the peasantry. It is said that in their attacks upon the Jews, the people had said, "We will make our breakfast of the Jews, our dinner of the landowners, and our supper of the priests." Priests and nobles fell into line with the ministers. In 1889 and 1890, the nobles were given a preponderating influence over the other representatives and the zemstvos. They became little more than assemblies of loyal landowners, open to the direct influence of the government. The mir was similarly enfeebled and lost its popular representative value. The judicial system was correspondingly modified. Public executions were abandoned in the spirit of the age, and some other improvements were introduced. But the general scheme set up by Alexander II had been too grossly ignored in the later years of the monarch, and it was now modified by decree. The jury system was reduced, the justices of the peace abolished. Petty cases fell back to the reorganized zemstvos. The financial system, on the other hand, remained for many years under the control of an enlightened minister, Bungie, and was greatly improved. Finance was in any case a department into which it was profitable to admit modern science. The coinage was improved, and more banks were established. Home industry was fostered, and the great extension of the empire in Asia opened new markets. Railways were multiplied, and in 1891, the Grand Duke Nicholas opened the terminal station of the proposed Trans-Serbian Railway at Vladivostok. Russia had already made commercial treaties with Korea and Japan. We will return presently to this dangerous extension of Russian ambition. Most important and characteristic of all was the process of Russification, in which all these engines of reaction were combined. One can understand the fascination of the Slavophile dream as it was formed in the mind of honest conservatives. Every concession made in the Western democracies and limited monarchies had led to further demands. Napoleon III had lost his throne. The papacy had lost its temporal power. William I and Bismarck were struggling against a portentous growth of socialism. France was rapidly shedding its religion. Even in England, the Republican movement was at that time, the 80s, strong, and lower depths of radicalism were disclosed every decade. Liberalism, either in religion or politics, was evidently a slope. You could not remain long elsewhere than at the top or the bottom. So Russia must be made thoroughly, homogeneously autocratic and religious. In spite of the well-known facts of Russian history, the Church agreed warmly with the Romanoffs that the autocracy was divinely appointed. If all could be made docile to the Church, the autocracy would have an easier task. So began the process of Russification, which passed with the brutality of a steamroller over every sect or fragment of the nation that was not Russian in creed and dynastic in politics. The Jews formed the gravest problem. Long experience had shown that no power on earth could erase the religious and racial peculiarities of the Jew. Yet there were nearly 5 million Jews in the Russian Empire. Their intelligence and skill in trade were but additional grievances. There were, even then, parts of Russia in which the Jews showed that, under proper treatment, they were as capable as any of settling upon the soil. But as a rule, they avoided agriculture. The slightest relaxation of pressure allowed them to pour into a city or even a district, and as traders and moneylenders, they soon had the poor and thriftless Russians in their power. Hence, in great measure, the readiness of the people to rise against them, which was gradually exploited rather than checked from St. Petersburg. The first procedure of the reactionary ministers was to overlook the massacres which took place from the beginning of the rule of Alexander III. Presently, a series of temporary rules were issued against them. Even in the Pale of Settlement, they were compelled to live in the towns and were forbidden to purchase real estate in the country. In 1888, they were ordered to go back to the place in which they had lived before the year 1882. About 1.5 million of the Jews were affected by this rule, and the chaotic abandonment of their several businesses and properties cast large numbers of them into deep and undeserved poverty. Vast aggregations of them, growing at a prodigious rate on account of their high fertility, huddled together in the towns of the Pale, and lived in great privation. In 1891, a new application of the rules exiled and ruined 17,000 Jewish artisans of Moscow. Still more stupid and hardly less cruel was the restriction upon the development of their ability. The civil service and the professions were closed against them. They might not, without special license, have a Christian servant, and notaries were forbidden to have Jewish clerks. Their zeal for education was similarly repressed, and the universities, which were situated in the Pale Jewish students, must not number more than 1/10 of the whole. At other provincial universities, they must not number more than 5%. At the metropolitan universities, not more than 2%. By these contemptuous repressive measures, the ignorant people were prepared for the pogroms which would disgrace the reign of the last of the Romanoffs. The Poles were the next most conspicuous victims of the Slavophile policy. We saw that Alexander II had ordered the extinction of their nationality. But a people with an acute memory of having been a great civilization at a time when the Russians were a disorderly mass of semi-barbarians could not easily resign itself to obliteration. The religious tradition here coincided with the national, as in Ireland, the Poland of the West, and the priests generally fostered insurgents. Alexander's ruthless ministers had but to apply more stringently the laws already in force against the Poles. From the University of Warsaw to the smallest elementary school, the teaching was entirely Russianized. Even the Bank of Warsaw was suppressed, and Polish trade forced into a branch of the Russian Bank. There was a futile rising in 1885, but 4 executions and 200 arrests completed the work of pacifying the country, or eliminating from it every man of spirit and courage. Even Finland, which was still autonomous, had to complain to the Czar of encroachments upon the liberties which his father had sworn to respect. In the other Baltic provinces, the Russian roller was used as in Poland. The dissenters and heretics of every kind in Russia itself were similarly treated. To the tenacious dissenters of the last century or two were now added sects like the Dukhobors and the followers of Tolstoy, and upon these the Tsar's ministers fell with particular malevolence. Alexander was ignorant enough to believe quite sincerely in the doctrines of the Orthodox Church, but he knew that these new sects had more than a religious significance. Prayer meetings were prohibited. Even children were separated in some cases from their parents and forced into the rigid Slavophile mold. It will be understood, after this description of the machinery that was set up by Tolstoy and Pobiedonostseff, that the chronicle of revolt in the reign of Alexander II is comparatively slender. It is computed that by the end of the reign there were about 100,000 rebels in the jails, the mines, and the Siberian colonies, and to these one must add the graves of the bolder spirits in the large numbers of the Russians who sought abroad the liberty that had died in Russia. Men still risked their lives in printing and disseminating the new ideas, but as the long reign wore on, and tyranny was still enthroned, the open spurts of defiance grew less in number. The revolutionaries and liberals felt that if their race was not to be extinguished, as the reactionaries desired, the work must proceed in different form. We shall see in the next and final chapter how it proceeded until, after further bloody revolts against the intolerable tyranny, it succeeded in awakening the people and shaking the Romanoffs from their throne. It remains to see how the Pan-Slav movement, the twin brother of the Slavophile philosophy, also prepared the way for the next reign. We have seen how every expansion of Russia, every enlargement of its stupendous population, and therefore ultimate resources, alarmed some other European power. Russia now made new advances and opened the way for fresh conflicts. It had reached the eastern coast of Asia. Now, it began its interference in Korea and attracted the attention of Japan. It spread south toward India and still further alarmed England. Journals of the imperial school at St. Petersburg openly boasted that their armies were beaten a path to the Indian Ocean, and it may be said, in justification of England's long distrust of Russia, that the Romanoffs wholly encouraged this dream until an Asiatic power proved to them that Asia was not the helpless world they had imagined. When the southern limit of Asiatic Russia was extended until it came, at certain points, within 140 miles of India, when Russian agents swarmed in Afghanistan, it was not unnatural that London should be nervous. Alexander III, however, took a keen personal interest in foreign affairs, and he succeeded in averting serious trouble with England. Still more dangerous to the peace of the world was the ambition of the Pan-Slavs to overrun the Balkans. Our generation is familiar enough with the philosophy in the form of Pan-Germanism, and from this the mood of Russian in the days of Alexander III will be understood. The creed of the Pan-Slavs was a mixture of commercial greed, imperialistic ambition, the impulses of soldiers to use their weapons, and the desire of priests to enlarge their church. As the little peoples of the Balkans were largely Slav, though the Bulgars are as much Asiatic as Slav, and the Rumans take more pride in their remote descent from the Romans, it was inevitable that, in spite of the jealous watchfulness of all the great powers of Europe, the new imperialists of St. Petersburg should push their work in the Balkans. There is this almost single advantage in the reign of Alexander III, that he distrusted Germany and did not allow his ambitious ministers to embroil the country in war. Bismarck would like to see Russia weakened, as it periodically was, by war, and there seemed to be every prospect of war over the Balkan peoples. Behind the specious plea of liberating Christians from the brutality of the Turk and conveying civilization to the backward peoples of the Balkans, there was at that time, as in our own days, a dual rivalry. Austria and the papacy had an ambition which was directly opposed to the ambition of the statesmen and priests of St. Petersburg. The path to Mediterranean and the commercial advantage of exploiting the Balkan peoples were not more eagerly sought by politicians and merchants than the religious allegiance of the independent Balkan churches was sought by the Vatican and the Holy Synod. Russia pushed its ambition in Bulgaria, Austria and Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had been entrusted to its protection. But the little Balkan peoples were now almost entirely awake to the designs of the ministers of Alexander III. The Tsar said on one occasion that the King of Montenegro was the only friend he had in Europe. The Serbs and Rumans drew nearer to Austria. The Bulgars began to resent the presence amongst them of so many officers of the Russian army and agents of the Russian government. After the Bulgar Revolution of 1885, there seemed to be grave prospect of a war between Austria and Russia. But Alexander was made sensible of the disgusting duplicity with which Bismarck tried to draw Russia into dangerous waters in the south, and he withdrew his officers from Bulgaria. He complained to the German emperor of the procedure of the chancellor, but he maintained the commercial alliance with Germany and the ostensibly friendly relations. Out of this rivalry of interests and clash of intrigue, in which Alexander III acted with caution and shrewdness, there gradually emerged the set of alliances which would one day deluge Europe with blood. Germany and Austria made a common lot of their interests and drew together. Italy, jealous of the French support of the papacy and won by the deceitful promises of Germany, joined them and formed the Triple Alliance. Russia could no longer remain isolated, and Alexander III slowly and reluctantly overcame his imperial dislike of the French Republic. Little acts of mutual courtesy led up to the floating of a large loan in France in 1887. The financial link with Germany was almost severed. In the following year, a Russian representative was appointed to the Vatican. In 1890, a large French fleet appeared at the Kronstadt and was boisterously welcomed. In 1893, the year before the death of Alexander, a commercial treaty with France was signed. Thus, in both domestic and foreign policy, the reign of Alexander III was one of preparation for the final chapter of the romance of the Romanoffs. It created at home a machinery of despotism which would prove so heavy that it aroused the very people whom it was designed to suppress. Abroad, it entered upon imperialistic ventures which would lead to wars that would expose the disgusting growth of corruption under the shelter of the universal censorship. Alexander III died in 1894, November the 1st, and left to the last of his line a country which he had apparently pacified. He was honest in his creed of orthodoxy and autocracy, though we will not suppose that he was insensible of its profit to himself and his family. But he had not the intelligence to see that such an anachronism as his medieval suppression of a people's sentiments could not live in the atmosphere of the end of the 19th century. End of section 18. Recorded by Issam El Arabi.
Section 19 of The Romance of the Romanoffs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in September 2020. The Romance of the Romanoffs by Joseph Martin McCabe. Chapter 16. The Last of the Romanoffs. The crowning act of the drama of the Romanoffs has a peculiar irony. One could well imagine a Romanoff of the 17th or 18th century making a ferocious struggle against the democratic forces which now threatened the autocracy. For those older monarchs, power had been a means of obtaining wealth, of enlarging their individual pleasures to royal or imperial proportions, and they would use all the machinery of despotism to maintain their splendid privileges. But in proportion as the democratic menace grew in the 19th century, the voluptuous selfishness of the Russian monarchs diminished. The serious, almost ascetic standards set up by Alexander I lingered in the imperial palaces, and it seemed that the less personal gratification the monarch received from his autocratic power, the more resolutely he fought to retain it. The last of the Romanoffs was one of the most sober and industrious of his line, and his reign was disgraced by a more bloody and cruel coercion than had reddened the reign of any of his predecessors. Nicholas II, son of Alexander III and Princess Dagmar of Denmark, is one of those tantalizing personalities whom one knows to be in themselves far removed from subtlety, yet whom one cannot honestly pretend to understand. He came to the throne an unknown man, eagerly scrutinized by every moderate reformer in Russia. He departs from it with his personality and actions still largely enveloped in mystery. This obscurity is, as I said, not due to any depth or subtlety in the mind of the Czar. It is due rather to the weakness of his character. Two sets of influences surrounded him, bending to their will his frail personality and substituting their cupidity or prejudice for his native impulses. The inner circle was that of his family, in which his mother and uncles were the leading and most mischievous figures. The outer circle was the ring of adventurers or reactionaries, whom the strength of his older relatives or the febrility of his own character invested successively with ministerial power. Beyond these, again, were the religious charlatans who at times preyed upon the superstition of the Tsar and Tsarina, the great body of ecclesiastical and other officers whose interest it was to maintain the existing system, and the doctrinaire conservatives, who, with purblind eyes, insisted upon the isolation of Russia from the progress of the world. Through this maze of intrigue and influence, it is difficult to reach the personality of Nicholas II with confidence, and the fierce partisanship of writers on both sides in the great struggle increases our task of disentangling the precise parts in the final catastrophe. It seems, however, to be an error to regard the last of the Romanoffs as a mere puppet, a tearful and hysterical implement of the reactionary influences which surrounded him. Nicholas had not the robustness of his father, whose dwarf intellect had been lodged in the frame of a Russian giant, but he was stronger than many literary portraits of him suggest to us. His education had been severely controlled. Distinguished experts had taught him those branches of culture, law, history, and political economy which were deemed necessary in a successor of Alexander III, and a rigorous physical training had braced the comparative feebleness of his person. He swam and rowed with skill, he played tennis and hunted, and throughout his reign he loved a long walk, often of 10 or 15 miles, and would at times burden himself with all the equipment of a common infantryman. It is said that the saber cut on the head which he received from a Japanese fanatic in 1891, when he made a tour of the Empire and further Asia, injured his brain and led to nervous instability. But this is one of the many statements of revolutionary writers which have not been checked by sober criticism. He came to the throne in 1894, a cool, self-possessed, carefully educated young man of 26, and some hope was excited in the breast of moderate Russian liberalism. To this it may be added that throughout his reign Nicholas II adhered to a sober and industrious standard of life. Here indeed the writers of the opposing schools begin to differ. That he was a man of comparatively simple and sober tastes none disputes. His table was temperate and conspicuous for old Russian dishes. He spent his leisure in the domestic circle, playing dominoes or billiards in the metropolitan palaces, sharing walks or rides or sails with his family in the provinces. He opened every day with religious observances, had the family icons brought on voyages, and rigorously kept the fasts of the church. But his industry and attention to affairs are differently represented. Conservatives picture him a model of severe self-sacrifice. He worked, they say, without secretaries, 10 or 12 hours every day. He minutely studied and annotated every document. He wore his pencil to the stump, the conservative pen records this with awed amazement, and then gave the stump gravely to his son. One imagines him relaxing from the cares of empire but for an hour in the evening. The revolutionary writers, however, depict him differently. They represent that he attended impatiently to serious affairs and spent an abnormal proportion of the day in the petty amusements of the domestic circle. The truth lies between the extremes. Nicholas II was industrious, and he attempted to discharge his functions very seriously within the limits of his narrow and mediocre conceptions. His people were not long in doubt as to the nature of his ideal. It was the ideal which each Romanoff of the century had naively conceived afresh, a complete retention of the autocracy, coupled with a benevolent intention to help his people. On the day of his father's death, Nicholas issued a manifesto in which he promised to promote the progress and peaceful glory of his dear Russia and the happiness of his faithful subjects. To the deputies who came to congratulate him, he said that, as his foreign minister M. de Guire also assured foreign powers, he would maintain his father's policy. Plainly, the young emperor approached his task with the customary confidence of youth. He would avoid the error of his predecessors and, by wise moderation, disarm the malcontents and sustain a benevolent despotism. But Nicholas soon discovered that the last reign still survived in such power as to admit no new experiments. His mother, the Dowager Empress, was a harsh and arrogant woman, uniting to her political ignorance and incompetence a fierce resolution to have her husband's policy sustained. Nicholas's uncle, the Grand Dukes Sergius and Alexander, were of the same harshly despotic temper, and Pobiedonostseff, the head of the Holy Synod, was the enthusiastic supporter of their wishes. These four, with the reactionary ministers Pleve, Muraviev, and Benzobrazov, later Admiral Alexiev and others, whom they gradually discovered and promoted, formed what came to be known as the Immortal Seven, the caucus which led the dynasty to its destruction. Nicholas was not married at the time of his accession. It was not until November that he married Princess Alix of Hesse-Darmstadt, who entered the Orthodox Church and adopted the name of Alexandra Feodorovna. It is said that at the last moment the Dowager Empress took a violent dislike to her, and enlivened the palace with lamentable exhibitions of her violent temper. It is at least clear that in the earlier years the Tsarina had no influence. Only in the last phase did she, by her pro-German leanings and her ignorant susceptibility to the intrigues of religious adventurers, contribute to the downfall of the monarchy. Nicholas was crowned at Moscow on May 26, 1895, and a terrible catastrophe clouded the very opening of his reign. Hundreds of thousands of peasants flocked to Moscow for the festivity and for the presents which were promised them, and they spent the night packed into the field of Kodinsky. A panic arose amongst them, and about 1,000 of them, some say several thousand, were trodden underfoot or cast into the ditch and perished. It was a bad beginning, and the Tsar soon made matters worse. In July, nearly 200 delegations brought to his palace the congratulations of every class of his people, and faint and respectful suggestions of reform were inserted in the bouquets of traditional compliment. From the province of Tver especially came a demand for liberal institutions, and the emperor received it with a smiling disdain which showed how little he understood his country. These were foolish dreams, he said. He would devote all his strength to the welfare of his country, but he would, with equal firmness, maintain the autocracy. A few reforms were introduced. Count de Witt fought his way to the head of the treasury and improved the finances. The immense flow of paper money was checked, and gold was accumulated at the banks or put into circulation. Ukases were passed which directed the building of model houses for the workers, and regulated to some extent their condition in the growing industries of Russia. New railways were built and canals projected. The army was partly reorganized. The administrative and judiciary institutions of the empire extended to Siberia, the development of which was energetically pushed. A measure to give separated married women the control of their property was passed. Education was further enforced, though in this respect the reform was weakened or undone by the desperate efforts of the clergy to wrest the elementary schools from the Zemstvos. These reforms, however, like those of the preceding reigns, were trivial in comparisons with the mighty needs of Russia, and it was now felt by all but the incurable conservatives and the parasites of the autocracy that self-government, through popular institutions, was the first and essential condition of reform. On this issue the dynasty, or the misguided group who undertook to guide its fortunes, staked its existence. How far any of the reactionaries really believed that the autocracy was for the welfare of the Russian people, it is not our place to consider here. The antagonistic forces moved slowly toward the field of battle. With the general policy and personal adventures of Nicholas II I am not concerned. The whole interest of the story is now concentrated in the growth of the conflict which will presently put an end to the Romanoffs. It suffices to say that Russophilism and Pan-Slavism continued to act together, and were equally responsible for the fall of the dynasty. Nicholas II professed a humane dislike of the coercive policy of his father, and in some respects, in the early years, the zeal of officials in persecuting dissenters was moderated. But the facts of the entire reign are within the memory of my readers, and their ghastly inconsistence with this humane profession need scarcely be emphasized. Never since the Middle Ages had the Jews suffered so brutally at the hands of their Christian masters. Unscrupulous officials and bodies of ignorant men like the Black Hundreds soon learned that massacre and pillage of the Jews were looked upon with favor at the palace, and the repeated pogroms are in themselves an indelible disgrace upon the name of Nicholas II. The Russianization of the Poles, for which Russia pays heavily today, and the Lithuanians was maintained with all the earlier brutality, and in regard to the Finns, Nicholas II incurred a peculiar stigma. He had at his accession sworn to respect the rights and the constitution of the Finns, but before long his officials tore up his oath and began to strip the vigorous little people of its nationality. Hardly a year of the Tsar's reign passed without some callous violation of his solemn promise, done with his express authority. The whole empire must, in spite of every obligation, be squeezed into the Russian mold. The only extenuating feature of this section of the Tsar's work that one can suggest is that the Russian people generally were in accord with this harsh and unjust procedure. The imperialistic tendency which led to this injustice equally shaped the disastrous foreign policy of Nicholas II. There can be little doubt that the Tsar desired a continuance of the peace which Russia had enjoyed during his father's reign, and for my part I am ready to recognize his sincerity in issuing a summons to a peace congress, August 24, 1898, the aims of which Nicholas defined in a personal letter, January 11, 1899. It was, as we now know, Germany which chiefly frustrated that well-meant effort. The Tsar remained friendly with Germany, which then wavered between a Russian and an English entente, while further strengthening his alliance with France. But the Tsar's desire of peace was, from the general practical point of view, rendered nugatory by his imperialistic policy. In the Balkans, he maintained that policy of secret and subtle infiltration which prepared the way for a conflict with Austria. Alexander III had in effect retired from the Balkans, disgusted at the ingratitude of the principalities Russia had helped to set up. Nicholas II resumed the policy of disguised penetration, and it is not too much to say that the southern Slavs felt almost as much apprehension at the shadow of Russia as at the encroachments of Austria. It was, however, the imperialist adventures in the Far East which contained the gravest danger and were least respectable in principle. It was entirely natural that Russia should spread along its Trans-Siberian line, develop its vast domains in Asia, and seek ice-free ports on the eastern coast. This national ambition was, however, complicated by sordid speculations on the part of men and women who, directly or indirectly, had influence over the Tsar. Revolutionary writers say that the Dowager Empress herself speculated heavily in Asiatic properties, and at least it may be regarded as certain that the Grand Dukes and adherents of the court sought fortune in that direction. From Siberia, these cupidities reached out toward Manchuria and Korea, and had large and vague designs upon helpless China. Russia, so the formula ran, was the heir of Genghis Khan and Timur. It had a divine mission to impose its Kultur upon Asia. The very thin strain of Tartar blood in the veins of Russia was at length discovered to have some value. The Chino-Japanese War occurred in the first year of the reign of Nicholas II, and the rise of an Asiatic power in the path of Russian ambition caused a momentary concern. Japan must be promptly checked, and at the close of the war Russia bluntly refused to allow Japan to occupy any of the territory it had seized. Germany astutely watched and fostered the dangerous adventure which diverted Russia from Europe to the Far East. Under cover of its supposed protection of China, Russia then established itself in Manchuria, secured, with money borrowed from France and England, a financial hold on China, and in 1898 obtained a long lease of Port Arthur and Talyuan. The cold anger of the Japanese at this piece of perfidy was little disguised, and presently Russia was requested to carry out its promise to evacuate Manchuria. From its new ports, it was plain to all Russia would spread to Korea. The other European powers now joined in the protest of Japan, and Russia sought to gain time by long negotiations, while it pressed the development of Port Arthur and Dalny. These devices Japan, in 1904, sternly cut short by making war. The documentary evidence in regard to those aspects of the Russo-Japanese War which concern us here is in the same unsatisfactory condition as so much of the evidence on which we must rely in this chapter. It awaits the impartial sifting of history. The suppression of truth in Russia throughout the reign of Nicholas II had the inevitable effect of provoking abroad a stream of something more than the truth. Writers and orators of revolutionary parties do not usually make calm and conscientious reflection on the statements they repeat, and in every country of the world the Russian writers found a large public eager to hear sensational stories about the court and the bureaucracy. It is at present entirely impossible to select with any confidence the reliable statements from the mass of legends which were published in Europe and America by the critics of the dynasty. Their fellows in Russia were, we shall see, being butchered in thousands, and were in tens of thousands suffering an agony which they often terminated by suicide. And, on the other hand, many of the chief agents of this bloody system were undoubtedly corrupt adventurers or cynical egoists. In the vast anti-Romanoff literature, therefore, we cannot look for judicious impartiality, and if the reader misses from this chapter many a picturesque legend which he has read in the scorching pages of revolutionary writers, he must not be surprised. The history of that appalling reign is still to be written. As far as the Russo-Japanese War is concerned, we need not hesitate to admit 3 points. The first is that the Czar, if not some of his ministers, sincerely believed that the little nation of the Far East would never have the audacity to fight mighty Russia, and that Germany encouraged the Russian court in this view. Japan was bluffing, the Czar was assured, and he might pursue his eastern extension under cover of a hollow and dilatory diplomatic negotiation. The second clear point is that this eastern extension of Russia was very largely due to the corrupt and selfish ambitions of influential individuals. Stories about the investments of the Dowager Empress or the Grand Dukes or other persons of the Tsar's circle may or may not be true. There is fair evidence that a speculative fever penetrated the court. In any case, the divine mission of Russia in the Far East was as hollow a pretense as the divine mission of Germany in the West in 1914. The third established point, and the one of most importance for our purpose, is that members of the imperial family and servants of the reactionary regime made vast sums of money by a corrupt diversion of goods and funds from the purposes of war to their private purses. The knowledge of these facts came to thoughtful people in Russia as the ignominious campaign dragged on from month to month. Public opinion, startled by the success of what they had been taught to regard as a tribe of monkeys against their great army, looked for hidden reasons of Russia's failure, and they were brought to light. It was known that aristocratic officers gambled and rioted in the Asiatic towns. It was known that trained regiments of the regular army were kept at home to coerce Russia, while crowds of reservists were hurried out to meet the deadly Japanese fire. It was known that the large sums extorted from the people for the prosecution of the war were to a great extent diverted. It was known that Count de Witt and Count Lambsdorff had tried to avert war, and that Manchurian affairs had then been entrusted to a favorite of the palace clique, Admiral Alexiev. Before the war was half over, the revolution was again aflame in Russia, and it grew daily. We are told by writers who seem to have had the confidence of the revolutionaries that the complete suppression of overt criticism by Alexander III and his son had led to the formation of a new and very powerful secret movement. It had branches in all parts of Russia, and it is said to have had as many as 3 million members in the year 1904. 12 men of distinguished ability directed its propaganda, and many wealthy Russians, disgusted at or injured by the atrocious system which Nicholas II maintained, devoted their whole fortunes to its work. Many of the stories told of its secret action are melodramatic and improbable, but it cannot be doubted that a vast and well-organized movement existed, not unlike the secret republican organization which was then being formed in Portugal. The Russian movement, however, was not definitely republican. It aimed at converting the czar, under pressure of his people, to constitutional views. It resented and despised the turbulent movements of the students and socialists, and it countenanced assassination only in very grave and carefully selected cases. We are told that its agents repeatedly placed on the Tsar's desk letters in which the situation was fully described, and Nicholas was urged to make peace with his people by granting a constitution and casting off the influence of the Dowager Empress. The early agitation was crushed with the customary brutality. One of the most repulsive adventurers of the time, Plehve, had become Minister of the Interior, and under his genial lead the police and magistrates fell upon every suspicion of revolt. Over the greater part of Russia the protection of civil law had been virtually suspended since 1881. Under what was called the Regulation for Reinforced Protection, suspects might be at any time arrested and imprisoned, journals suppressed, the civil courts entirely ignored. In the year 1903, nearly 400 men and women had been arrested under this barbarous system, and it was estimated that there were already more than 100,000 in the jails of Russia and in Siberia. The work had continued, however, and the revolutionaries boast that in the very year before the war, the year when they seemed to be feeblest, they circulated 2 million pamphlets among the Russian people. As the agitation grew with the war, Plehve retorted with increased savagery, and on July 28, 1904, he was, in spite of his extraordinary precautions, assassinated. The murderer, Sazonov, was sentenced only to 20 years' imprisonment, and Nicholas reduced this to 14 years. The revolutionaries claim that they warned the Tsar that he answered with his life for the life of Sazonov. It was, at all events, made plain to the Tsar by the press of Europe that his system of ruling was regarded as barbarous. A more moderate man, or one who claimed at least to have some sympathy with liberalism, Prince Sviatopolk Mirsky, was put in charge of the Ministry of the Interior, and the struggle passed to a new phase. On November 19th, the police of St. Petersburg permitted a large meeting of members of the provincial Zemstvos, and a deputation of these was allowed to see Prince Mirsky. They demanded free parliamentary institutions and manhood suffrage, and the prince undertook to lay their demands before the Tsar. It is reported that the Dowager Empress, the Grand Dukes, and the reactionary ministers violently opposed any concession, and we must assume both that they would be consulted and they would give this advice. The Tsar was nervous and timorous, physically and mentally unequal to the great burden which now lay upon him. On December 12th he issued a ukase in which he promised reforms, but he described the demands of the representatives of the Zemstvos as inadmissible and inconsistent with the fundamental laws of the empire. The bulk of his people were, he said, true to the old foundations of the state organization, and he would protect them from the intrigues of agitators. The battle continued. A great meeting at St. Petersburg was addressed openly by writers and scholars of distinction, and amongst the crowd the cry, "Down with the autocracy," was heard. Petitions and demands for representative institutions rained upon the Tsar from all classes of his subjects. Strikes and riots filled the daily press. On January 9th, the notorious Father Gapon led 300,000 workers to the Winter Palace to lay their grievances before the Little Father, and before evening the snows of St. Petersburg were stained with the blood of thousands. There were spurts of revolt of Kishinev, Odessa, Moscow, and even Kronstadt. On February 4th, the Grand Duke Sergius, the most corrupt of the reactionaries, was assassinated. Prince Mirsky resigned and was succeeded by Buligin. Before the new minister was established, the Tsar issued a new ukase affirming the autocratic principle, but Buligin insisted that he should modify this act of mad defiance, dictated by the palace clique, by issuing on the same day a promise to convoke a consultative assembly of representatives of the people. He appointed a commission of inquiry, and in reply to a deputation from a second conference of the Zemstvos, he announced that a national assembly would soon be granted. The long-expected ukase appeared on May 10th. It opened on a note of repentance. A state cannot be solid until it holds as sacred the traditions of the past. We have failed in this, and God has punished us. The sovereignty of ancient Russia was indissolubly bound up with the voice of the land, with the representatives of the people assembled in council. For the first time the Romanoffs perceived that, centuries before their dynasty was cradled, Russia had had a past, and a democratic past. But the project of the new assembly, the first Duma, turned this avowal into derision. The business of the representatives of the people was merely to examine proposals which would be laid before the Imperial Council. The Tsar alone could initiate and pass legislation. By further regulations, in fact, the members of the Duma were put at the mercy of the conservative Senate. The autocracy was maintained in all its medievalism. Liberals and radicals now united in a fierce demand of reform. Russia was paralyzed by a general strike and the suspension of traffic. More than 1 million workers were on strike. In a momentary panic, the Tsar directed Count de Witt to draw up a list of reforms, and on October 30th, 1905, he issued the famous ukase which has since given a name to the vast body of moderate Russian reforms, the Octoberists. He would grant manhood suffrage, real national representation, freedom of speech and religion, and so on. As usual, the first breath of liberty let loose a passion of discussion. The radicals and the independents united to form the powerful body of the constitutional democrats, the cadets or KDs. A council of labor deputies was formed with the express purpose of holding the supreme power when the Tsar had been deposed. In brief, Russia was seen aflame with revolution. There were mutinies in the fleet at Kronstadt and at Sevastopol, and the audacity of the more radical elements led, at Moscow, to the futile and pathetic rebellion in which large numbers of students lost their lives. The revolution was premature. The troops were unprepared for revolt on such an issue as the Constitution, and the black bands everywhere aided the police and dipped their hands in the blood of Jews and radicals. The active rebellion was truculently suppressed, and the jails were packed to suffocation. His reactionary advisers urged the triumphant Tsar to refuse all concessions, but the rumble of the more moderate malcontents was still heard on every side, and the promise of some sort of national assembly had to be carried out. It was in these circumstances that, on May 10, 1906, Nicholas opened the first Duma. The name had been invented by the reforming minister of Alexander I, Speransky, and it represented the measure of popular representation which might have been regarded as satisfactory in those semi-feudal days. For a civilization of the 20th century, it was ridiculously inadequate, and it soon proved only a channel for the comparatively safe release of the boiling sentiment which filled the country. Before the Romanov dynasty fell, it was customary for polite journalists and essayists to explain that the excesses of the radicals frustrated the work of the new institution. It is unhappily true that the left wing of every reform movement uses a rhetoric which is little in accord with its loud insistence on justice, but in this case even the work of moderate members of the Duma was obnoxious to the authorities. Day by day, the state of the Russian jails, the gross conduct of police and military authorities, and the barbarous practices of their subordinates were brought to light. Week by week men waited, and waited in vain, for the further installments of reform which had been promised. The Duma grew more and more vehement in its attacks upon the government. The cadets formed the majority of its members, and they formulated their demands for adult suffrage, real parliamentary institutions, the abolition of capital punishment, a political amnesty, the suppression of the Imperial Council, and the expropriation of the large landowners. Goremykin, a tool of the palace clique which had put him in the place of Count de Witt, refused to comply, and on July 23rd the Tsar dissolved the Duma. The measure was a failure, and Goremykin had to surrender his place to Stolypin. The ejected cadets retired to Finland and appealed to the people to refuse to pay taxes or render military service, for which, 3 years later, they were condemned to imprisonment and the loss of their civil rights. Stolypin had the ingenious idea of severing the great mass of the peasants from the radicals by separate concessions, and in October and November the Tsar appealed for their support. They were put on the same footing as other classes in regard to the right of entering the public service or schools, the issue of passports, and in rural elections. They were released from obligatory residence in the district in which they were registered, permitted to take away their share of the communal property, and protected from punishment without trial. By these means, and by tampering with the electoral law, which he dare not yet alter, Stolypin secured a second Duma in which the cadets were greatly reduced. Instead of 185 seats, they now had only 108. But they still formed the largest party, and their leader Golovkin was president of the Duma. In face of their demands, the Tsar authorized Stolypin to offer the crown lands and imperial estates to be shared amongst the peasants, but the radicals were not appeased, and on June 14th, 3 months after the opening of the Duma, Stolypin demanded a secret session in order to consider an indictment of the Social Democrats, whose number had increased to 77 at the last election. Almost the whole of them were charged with complicity in a plot to undermine the loyalty of the army and navy. The Duma was still overwhelmingly radical, a sufficient commentary on the Tsar's claim that the mass of his people clung to the old traditions, and refused to lend itself to this maneuver. 2 days later, June 16th, Nicholas again asserted his power and dissolved the Second Duma. It was, he declared, not representative of the Russian spirit, and would not support his government in suppressing disorder. To make it more representative of this Russian spirit, which was supposed to animate the bulk of the population, he narrowed the electoral qualifications, in violation of his 1905 ukase, and reduced the membership from 524 to 442. The cadets now sank from 108 to 45, the socialists from 77 to 17. The conservatives rose from 60 to 100, and the Octobrists from 31 to 110. Liberalism, of one shade or another, still greatly outweighed conservatism even in this mangled representation of the Russian people, and assassinations, strikes, and fiery rhetoric impressed upon Europe the grievances of those who were excluded from representation. In the year 1907 there were 627 executions, and about 70,000 were sent into exile. In 1908 there were 786 executions, and the number of exiles rose to 180,000. The populations of the jails of Russia rose from 91,000 in the year 1904 to 174,000 in the year 1910. This was the comparative tranquility which the chroniclers of Russian events ascribed to the country between 1907 and 1917. Quarterly notices of the number of political executions were put into small type in English and American journals, and from the somber silence that brooded over the land there issued at times the lurid message of assassination. In 1909 occurred the astounding revelation of the secret police spy and professed socialist Atseff, and it became known that outrages were instigated by the police in order to strengthen their system. The former head of the police had to be sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment. The head of the secret police of St. Petersburg was assassinated. In 1911, Stolypin was permitted by the Tsar to suspend the Imperial Council and the Duma, so that he could avail himself of the clause of the Constitution which enabled him to pass laws while the councils were not sitting. And on September 14th, while Nicholas sat in his box in the opera at Kiev, he had the horror of witnessing the murder of his complacent minister. Still he clung to his poor rags of autocracy. Still religious adventurers and spiritist mediums plied their lucrative charlatanry in the palaces. Still the flower of the young generation rotted in the overcrowded jails or languished in Siberia. The jails had a maximum accommodation for 107,000 prisoners, and in 1910 about 180,000 men and women were crowded into them. Typhus flourished in them. Suicides of prisoners rose to 160 in a single month. The most brutal outrages were committed on young women and men. These facts one learned, as I experienced at the time, by a laborious comparison of the statements of little red writers and statistics. To the world at large a different picture was offered. Men were told how, in 1906, a group of affrighted Polish peasants, headed by an abbess, came to St. Petersburg to inquire if it was really true that, as zealous Roman Catholic proselytizers had told them, the Tsar had made his submission to the Pope. They saw a minister, on Easter morn, and to their solemn salutation, "Christ is risen," he blunderingly replied, "Good day," and their hearts sank. But they also saw Nicholas, and to their faltering religious salute he replied cheerfully, "In truth he is risen," and they fell sobbing at his feet. Or it was the festival of Poltava in 1909, when Nicholas, seeing his carriage surrounded by a dense throng of peasants, alighted and talked familiarly with them for 2 hours. And there was the story of how at Christmas 1912, when the members of the Duma were presented to him, he summoned the shrinking peasant deputies from the last row and honored them above the others. Nicholas II knew quite well what was happening in Russia. His small mind thought that tasting the food of soldiers and sailors, before a camera, visiting the hospitals, and embracing carefully selected peasants would save the autocracy in the 20th century. The 5-year period of the Third Duma expired in 1912, and the new election proved a victory for the conservatives. The Octobrists had ventured to resist the demand of the clergy that the elementary schools should be handed over to them, and the popes had fiercely and unscrupulously canvassed the peasant electors. Still, however, 285 Octobrists and other radicals faced the 155 members of the right, and small measures of reform had to be passed. They were inadequate, and the year 1913 saw another great wave of disturbance. The number of strikers rose to 460,000. At Kiev, a great gathering of representatives of all the towns of the empire condemned the government. The Octobrists united with the other radicals of the Duma, and, by 146 votes to 113, many abstaining, condemned the ministers for not proceeding in the path of reform. But I need not run in detail over events which are still fresh in the general memory. These brief notices will suffice to indicate that the spirit of progress lived and grew, in spite of every effort of Nicholas II to strangle it. The conflict entered upon its last stage. That Nicholas II wanted war, however much he may have hoped to profit by the aid of France and England, we have no reason whatever to believe. Nor is it possible as yet to pass a sober opinion upon the charge that he intended, when the war dragged, to make a separate peace with Germany. That his German wife was won by the miserable adventurer Rasputin, and some of his ministers by German bribery, seems clear enough. And although he had been second only to the Kaiser in the vigorous lead of his nation until the end of 1916, there is grave reason to think that he was then won by the prayers of his family and intrigues of his ministers. But the Russian Revolution was not based on this theory as much as is generally believed. The mass of the people were bewildered by the war, and have not since shown any great zeal to prosecute it. The educated malcontents were, as we saw, thoroughly organized, and ready to grasp any pretext for a successful revolution. Only a minority of military men and liberal politicians were essentially moved by the failure of the dynasty to arm Russia efficiently and prosecute the war. The food supply was the immediate ground of the revolution. On February 8th, when the 5-year period of the Duma of 1912 approached its term, the Tsar was urged to extend its life, as was done in other countries. The Tsar refused, and he spoke of elections in the coming fall. The suspicion that he was going to proceed irregularly coincided with a shortage of grain in the large cities, especially Petrograd, as the capital was now named, which was gradually stirring the anger of the people. We may assume that the revolutionary organization exploited this anger with all their power, and especially undermined the loyalty of the few regiments which were left at Petrograd. On March 8th, the people of Petrograd, especially the women, began to throng the streets, and the workers to quit the factories. Rodzianko, the president of the Duma, summoned a conference on the food question, and he and Professor Milyukov, the second hero of the revolution, strongly criticized the incompetence of the ministers. Rodzianko, a former officer of the guards and husband of a Golitsyn princess, was a noble of distinction, but he was an Octoberist and a friend of the people. The crowds were still larger in the streets on March 9th, and on Sunday the 11th they turned out in immense numbers and fraternized with the few troops who were visible. The guards, however, were imperfectly won, and on the Sunday afternoon they fired a volley into the crowd, and about 100 were killed or wounded. It is one of the strangest testimonies to the amazing condition of Russia that the crowds remained on the streets and said sympathetically to the soldiers, "We are sorry for you, brothers. You had to do your duty." On the Monday morning it became known that the Tsar had suspended for 2 months the sittings of the Duma and the Imperial Council, and the revolution was inaugurated. Troops to the number of about 30,000 marched upon the arsenal, distributed arms to the people, and fought the police and the loyal troops. The progressives and the socialists formed a committee of 12 of their ablest representatives, including Rodzianko, Milyukov, and Kerensky, and the Rodzianko telegraphed to the Tsar a peremptory demand for a new government. The fight with the police, who mounted the roofs with rifles and machine guns, was continued on the following day, but the public buildings fell one by one into the hands of the revolutionaries, and about midnight of the 13th to 14th, the enterprise was crowned by the submission to the provisional government of the Preobrajensky Guards. Moscow soon sent its adhesion, and the troops in the field gradually assured the new government of their allegiance. Nicholas II was with the army at the headquarters of General Ruzsky when the alarming news from Petrograd reached him. He would return to the capital, he said, but at Bolgoe station he was quietly persuaded to return to Pskov. There, in a small, dimly lighted room, the last of the Romanoffs received the delegates of the people, M. Guchkov and a conservative member of the Duma. It is said that Nicholas asked calmly what was required of him, and when he was told that he must abdicate, he at once demanded a piece of paper. He would not, however, resign the crown to his son, as they wished. He would not be parted from his son, he said, and it is probable that he was moved by his deep affection for the boy. He would leave the throne to his brother Michael. The fateful document was there and then composed, and Nicholas II signed away his power, signed, as it proved, the death warrant of the Romanov dynasty. He remains ambiguous in his last imperial pronouncement. In words of singular dignity and detachment, he answers the call of the Russian people to lay down his autocracy, and he prays for a speedy victory over Germany. But for the ghastly, unforgettable horrors which stain his reign, we could find words of admiration for the last weak descendant of Michael Romanoff. End of section 19. End of The Romance of the Romanoffs by Joseph Martin McCabe.